First off, I want to thank the Duplin District for supporting us and hosting us. Also want to thank our funders for making this possible. Farmland Preservation Team, ADFP Trust Fund, and of course the Tobacco Trust Fund all helped to put this on. So we're really grateful for that, and hopefully you will find this informative. I know the last two have, in my mind, have been a success for sure. It's been a really interactive session, so we hope that you all will participate and throw in your questions, and some good discussions should really come out of this. So we're excited to be able to have this, and I would anticipate that we'll continue to repeat this, whether it's on specific topics or more general discussion, and we plan to do this on a regular basis as long as the funding is still there. So with that being said, I think we should talk logistics and talk about the bathroom and the schedule, and then we'll do a round of introductions. So, Angie, do you want to give any?
Well, the restrooms are to your left at the hall. Our office is in the back corner. If you need anything else.
Okay, very good. Anything?
We're here at 11:45.
Okay, perfect. Yep, lunch. For you all, we did not take specific lunch orders, so it's going to be kind of a buffet style, so a selection of sandwiches and sides. They all sounded really delicious, local caterer, so look forward to that at lunchtime. We also are recording this session, so this will be made available later on our website for you all to access. We'll also have available all of the handouts and PowerPoints as well for reference back to, should you need it. I will ask that if you have a question, there's going to be a mic that we're passing around if you have a question, so that we can make sure to get that on camera, as this is a big room. And speakers, just like I'm doing here, just hold it. You don't have to clip it on unless you want to. So let's go around and do introductions. And when you introduce yourself, name who you're with, and if you've attended any of our conservation easement trainings before, and also for districts, if you have any easements that you hold or monitor, would be great. So I'll start. Amanda Sand, Executive Director with the Foundation, and I do not have any easements.
We need the mic.
Here, just do this one.
Okay.
Hey, I'm Mikey Falk. I'm the Executive Director for Working Lands Trust, and we have a lot of easements, so there's that.
I'll stand up. Lisa Sheely with Working Lands Trust. I'm the project manager, and we currently have 26 and a large portfolio of ones that we're working on, and look forward to talking to y'all more about that.
Evan Davis, NCDA, Farmland Preservation. We've been to several of these workshops.
I'm Joe Austin, Farmland Preservation Field Staff for the southeastern North Carolina area, which includes Duplin, Onslow, and the surrounding counties here. Thank you.
Edward Davis, Farmland Preservation, South Central region, which includes from New Hanover to Brunswick County, all the way to Richmond, Moore, Lee, that area there, 12 counties.
I'm Lee Kennedy. I'm the CREP specialist with North Carolina Division of Soil and Water Conservation, and I cover, my territory is everything on the Neuse River, Tar River, Roanoke River, Pasquotank Drainage Basin. I pretty much cover all of northeastern North Carolina, and I've never been to one of these trainings before.
I'm Ryan Manning. I'll be working in partnership with the Foundation for Farmland Preservation projects, and I've been to a number of these meetings before.
Angie Quinn, I'm here in Duplin, and we have 5 easements. I've never been to one of these trainings before.
Pam Hawkins with the Craven Soil and Water Conservation District, our first training of this kind.
Andy Metz, I'm with ATAC with NRCS.
Celeste Moss, I'm with Chowan Soil and Water. I've been to one, but it was right when I first started. So this is be probably a better learning for me, because I'll be able to understand what you're talking about. We did not have any easements at the time in Chowan.
Anita Kennedy. I'm with NCDA in the central office staff, and this is my second training.
Allison Rodriguez, I'm also with Farmland Preservation. I'm the budget administrator, and this is my second training as well.
I'm Rodney Woolard. I'm the field specialist for the ADFP staff up in the Northeast. And I guess we would say, Evan, we don't hold easements, right? Is that the right thing to say? But
hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Lynn Wren, and I work for Vance County Soil and Water. I'm the admin education coordinator. This is my third training consecutively, and I've only been with Soil and Water for a little over a year, so it's a new career for me. I love it. My husband's farms. I was raised on a farm, and as of right now, we do not have any easements.
Come this way and then back to you.
This is Victor Youngblood. I'm with NCDA, Farmland Preservation, and never been to one of these trainings. Pretty green at this stuff, but hopefully I'll be working with some eligibility issues in that space.
I'm Bobby Rose. I'm with the NCDA, the Farmland Preservation Division. I'll be working with Victor, working within RCS to take care of some eligibility issues.
I'm Charlie Sanders. I'm with Dare County. As far as I know, we don't have any easements, and this is the first training I've been to for this.
I'm Chad Strong, Craven County Planning Director. We've got some interest from some citizens in regarding to participating, especially on the west end of our county, where we have a lot of farmland. I have not been to any trainings, so I'm looking forward to learning today.
Brody Brown, Craven Soil and Water. This is my first farmland preservation training, and as far as I know, we don't have any easements.
I'm Gail Hughes. I work with the foundation and project manager for the conservation easement training.
All right, I'm Brian Lodeholt. I'm with Natural Resource Conservation Service. I am the easement coordinator, and I manage our easement program throughout the state. That's both L and dabble in some WRE.
Nathaniel, Beaufort Soil and Water. It's my second training, and we are close to closing our first easement.
I'm Tom Potter. I work with the North Carolina Foundation for Soil and Water Conservation.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. And Ryan mentioned it, and I'd like to introduce him again. So this has kind of been a long time coming, but we have a grant that supports one-on-one interaction with districts that need assistance, capacity, filling out applications for easements, baseline documentation reports, all of that good stuff, landowner meetings, et cetera. And so about a year and a half ago, we received the funding and have waited this long for the perfect individual to come along. And so that person is Ryan. So Ryan's going to be joining us, and will be able to assist you all in whatever questions, concerns, capacity issues that you may have within your district. So we'll be putting his information out on the listserv for you all, so you have his contact information to be able to work with you directly on any sort of issues that you have. So we're very excited to have Ryan on board, so thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, everybody. She never had to worry about me speaking up because Lord have mercy. My name is Mikey Falk. I know I said that earlier. My real name is Michael, okay? I'm the last of 5 girls, and my daddy wanted a boy real bad, and my mama says she was done, by all means, having youngins, so Michael it was. So I'm originally from Robeson County, born and raised just around Fairmont, Lumberton, that area. I attended NC State, go Pack. I don't know if I got any NC State folks here. Yes, yes, yes. So went there, but after I'm a wildlife biologist by trade, so that's what I was trained as. When I left NC State, I went to Montana. I lived in Montana for 13 years. I worked with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I actually ran all their hunting access programs in the northeast corner. So if you ever want to take a trip to hunt in Montana, let me know, and I can at least point you in the right direction. So I did a lot of hunting and fishing on my own, which I've done all my life, and it was a good place to be. I also worked as a with a private firm down in Wyoming as a wildlife biologist. I did a lot of work on reclamation sites and open pit mines, and it makes you feel real small when you're in that in a little tiny truck. So, but yeah, I'm a North Carolina girl through and through. So after about 13 years, which I'm aging myself, I moved back to North Carolina, and I was with the Wildlife Resources Commission. So I was actually the hunter ed coordinator for all the Piedmont region. I say I taught hunter ed from 8 to 80, didn't matter. So, and I enjoyed it. I love visiting with folks. I love helping them learn about our resources. But I got recruited to come into the land trust world, and I was with another land trust here in North Carolina for over 6 years. I was with a national organization as well. And then I was blessed to be able to become the ED for Working Lands Trust, and I have finally found my home. I grew up in a farming community. My granddaddy farmed, and this is near and dear to me. So being able to work with these landowners to protect this legacy, that's been the highlight of my career, I will definitely say. I mean, I've seen a lot of critters and done a lot of things, but being able to help conserve my home state's agricultural and forestry resources has definitely been the highlight. So, with all that being said, I'm gonna let Lisa introduce herself too. She's with us. She is the best in the business right here, the project manager, and yeah.
Okay. So I am newer to North Carolina and farming, but I'm no stranger to conservation easements. So I've almost getting close to 20 years working in the conservation field with land trusts. But I've been on contract with Working Lands Trust since 2019, I believe. So I've worked on the majority of our projects in some capacity, and currently really do the project management from start to finish with the applications and the due diligence and closing, and do a little bit of the monitoring and that sort, and anything that I can help Mikey with. So that's me in a nutshell, and I'll be talking to y'all a little bit more about stewardship after Mikey covers a lot of the front end of everything. Please ask all of your questions. Don't let the microphones scare you. This is for you guys to really be tailored to you, let you get the information that you need to grow your programs or to start your programs. So thank you for being here.
So what I'm going to talk about is just conservation easements in general, some of the steps to take. This is our third one in this series, and I've learned that I had to speed up a little bit. So I've taken some slides out. I'm going to let ADFP, in all their glory, talk about some of the slides that we had up here before. Like I said, if you have any questions, just let me know. So let's talk about what is a land trust. I'm sure in this area it's probably coastal land trust, maybe? Coastal, some. Yeah, so a land trust, we're a nonprofit. We work to help to conserve properties. And land trusts have different goals, different missions. But in a nutshell, it's help to conserve property. That's basically what we do, but we're a nonprofit. Working Lands Trust is a little bit different. So a lot of the land trusts in North Carolina, they have certain areas. They cover certain areas. They're split across. I think there's like 20 some of them across North Carolina. So like Coastal has most of the chunk over here on the coast. There's Piedmont and Three Rivers and a few others. What's unique about Working Lands Trust, we cover the whole state, okay? And the other unique thing, which is good for our landowners, is we're the only land trust in North Carolina that's 100% dedicated to agriculture and forestry. That's all we do. Now, I've worked on all kinds of different easements in the past, from blueways and natural areas and riparian issues, and it's great and it's all needed. But working lands and agriculture and forestry, this is it. This is all we do, which for a lot of landowners, especially trying to get these type of easements, that means a lot to them. So, and it will be for y'all, right? I mean, y'all, that's what you work with, and they'll appreciate that that's what you're doing is just agricultural type easements. So what is a conservation easement for those of you who haven't done? The function of it is to conserve to protect conservation values. And there's a list of different values that an easement will protect. The ones that we're focused on is the agriculture and the forestry aspect of it. The structure, the purpose, the values, enabling legislation, rights and restrictions, function, and enforcement. That's what I'm talking about. So the agricultural type easements are different. I mean, there's all kind, like I said, there's all kinds of different easements, but these are very specific to our working lands. And then what's the benefits, you know? I mean, when it comes down to it, landowners are gonna say, well, what's in it for me, you know? I mean, besides being just a pillar of their community and creating a legacy and all that, there is funding that's available. And, or tax benefits. We are not tax professionals, so I do not even get into that realm. I tell them they need to talk to their tax or their tax person, I guess. But there is tax benefits as well. But the other part is the stewardship, the legacy of it, and we'll talk a little bit going forward. So what does the easement process encompass? So there's project assessment and selection. Which projects are we gonna do? That's pretty simple. Funding opportunities, applications, and grants. Where's the money gonna come from, and how do we get it? That's that section. Due diligence. What all do we have to do to make all these nice people in the blue shirts happy? That's all your due diligence items. And then we get to closing. Woohoo! We're at closing. That means we have got the landowner, got the property conserved, they're got paid or whatever they need, and everybody's happy. And then post-closing stewardship. So an easement, and the ones we do, now there are different, there's term easements there's 10, 30, there's different term easements, but the ones that Working Lands Trust, we as a nonprofit do, we focus on perpetual easements. And for a lot of folks, that's a scary word, you know, putting it in perpetuity. I mean, that's forever. That's literally until the Lord, until when he's ready to call us home, it's going to be conserved, right? And so it goes with the deed. So that conservation easement will always be attached to that property. So let's just say Lisa's got a piece of property and she's like, hey, I want to put a conservation easement on it. And I'm like, all right. And then she does it, we get it done, and 15 years, she said, I got to sell it. You know, what do I do? Whoever she sells it to, it goes with them. It goes with that property. So the property, when they purchase it, it will still have that conservation easement on it. So that's something, when you're talking to landowners, to make sure they understand that this is forever and ever, amen, right? So, all right, so the process, we talked about preliminary property assessment and prioritization, selection. You know, that's sort of your info, your data gathering, site visits, landowner conversations. And funding opportunities, applications, and grants. That's talking to the folks in blue, and including another blue over there in the NRCS. And then, of course, the DOD, right? So in this area, it'll be military funding. And due diligence and closing. That's all. So everybody's like, well, what all do I have to do? Well, there's a lot. There's a big checklist, and you'll hear that word checklist 15,000 times before we leave here today. As long as you follow the checklist, you'll be able to keep moving forward. ESA, survey, appraisal, the draft, the BDR, the title work, there's a lot of stuff. And it can seem overwhelming, and I ain't gonna lie to you. It's a lot. There is a lot to do with a conservation easement. But if you follow along and you do your checklist, it's very doable.
You've got the pro to work with now, too. So, Ryan, how many easements have you closed in your 15 years? A good many, I'm sure.
Of ADFP/ALE easements, I think we were closing in on 30 of them.
Okay.
And then we had various other donated, just other types of conservation.
Yeah, so your first few times, is going to be a lot, but Ryan here can walk you through, and it'll become second nature, right?
That is right. And as Lisa knows, she still has to keep me on track and keep me moving, and like I said, best in the business. So it is a lot. So don't ever feel like, Lord, maybe I should know this. No, you probably don't. You ain't never done it before, trust me. So call somebody, ask the questions. We'll also be doing some work with Amanda to sort of help y'all along as well. So the thing is a lot of times, land trusts, there's a lot of them. There's different organizations do a lot of the same things, get a little territorial. Not us. Don't you ever hesitate to call me. I just want y'all to be able to be the best that you can be and get this land conserved. So don't ever hesitate to give me a call and ask me anything that I got that can help you, I'll make sure you get. I do want to say this as a resource. So the land trusts in general, we have what's called the Land Trust Alliance, and that's sort of our like FDA, right, for the land trusts. And they sort of our governing body, keeps us all in line, the checks, the balances. But it's the voice of the land trust community. It's the national leader in policy, standards, education, and training. You can be a member of the Alliance without having to be as like a land trust accredited. So I know ADFP just signed up last year.
Yeah, so I was going to do a plug for this because I've used their website many times in the past week for various issues.
Hey, there you go.
I think I shared some information with Amanda and Ryan yesterday afternoon that I pulled from their website. So it is the cost for governmental units is based on unit operating budget and staff size. So that's how the pricing is scaled. It's not a flat fee. So it does range, but I will say that a lot of the resources that are very helpful through all parts of the process are behind the paywall, but I think there's a lot of benefit to that. And they do the legwork for you. So certainly something to look at, especially if you're unsure about certain items, deliverables, processes. They're a great guide for all that.
He's exactly right. There's a ton of information, and they have workshops and, you know, webinars that you can attend. I mean, it is just a plethora of information. So if there's any room in the budget to become, you know, a member with the Alliance, I mean, you can still see some things, you know, without being a member, but I would highly suggest it. It is well worth it. All right, don't be scared. That's a lot of writing. I know. Woo, that's a lot. But Lisa has beautifully color-coded everything, so I can tell you right off the bat. So this is just sort of preliminary property assessment and selection, right? So the IRS NC Code, Public Benefits, Conservation Values. Remember I told you these are all working land easements, so they're going to be very specific to agriculture and forestry. Funding source requirements from the people in the blue. You need to know, you know, what you need to have to be able to receive that funding. Risk assessment, we're going to talk about that. I know Evan will probably talk about that a little bit more too. Is it worth it? Is there red flags and whoever that showstoppers? So there are showstoppers that would prevent getting to closing. Because I'm going to tell you what, it's a lot. These are a lot of work. And all that legwork to get to towards closing and to find a showstopper, a red flag, is going to hurt your heart. It's really going to hurt your feelings. And so it's a lot of time and effort and money and sweat and tears and blood. So do your due diligence ahead of time. You know, you have the ESA, so you're looking for any red flags that might pop up for an environmental site, you know, title work. Those are the things. Just make sure you do due diligence. And then district program policy, you know, what is y'all's policy? So public benefits, like I said, these two top ones, active or farmland, significant forest types, those are the two that we're going to be focusing on. These other ones, you know, can be in a conservation easement. These are some of the, like I would use this language in different types of easements. But for us, it's going to be that farmland and forest. And then requirements. What does ADFP need? What does Brian need with NRCS? What's the military need? You need to make sure we know what their requirements are. And then feasibility risk assessment. This is the one I said to make sure you know what you're getting into. Like, what are they currently using it as? Surrounding uses. Are there any red flags environmental wise? I mean, if you got a sludge pit in the middle of it, it's probably going to throw a red flag somewhere, right? Landowner plans, what do they want to do down the road? So there's a lot of different things just to think about as you're starting to go through this easement work. Lisa made this slide, I think it's fantastic. It shows you funding sources and match funding opportunities. There's a lot of different types of easements, right? And Ryan alluded to them. There's donated easements, bargain sales. There's different things that you can do as a landowner to protect your property. But these easements are what's called purchased easements. And we are able to compensate the landowner for being able to put that easement on their property. So a standard way, which I know Evan will probably talk a little bit more about this too, 50% funding from ADFP of the price of the easement, cost of the easement, and then we can find a 50% match somewhere. Now, can that be from private folks? Yeah. The landowner can donate it. You can have just the county may have a little fund somewhere tucked away to try to match that funding. So there's a lot of different ways to get that. There you got ADFP and NRCS. That would be 100% funding. That's a match. We can get 100% of that easement paid out. Same thing with Department of Defense. There's another one. We can get all of it paid out. And I think Working Lands Trust was one of the first, either the first one, to ever get ADFP, NRCS, and DOD funds in one project. That was before my time, but I think it's fabulous. Hopefully we can do it again. Speaking of, so this area would be, and I know Tom's going to talk about this too, so I'm not going to delve a lot into it, but sort of the military, sentinel landscape, these are some of the priority areas. I'm just going, for sake of time, I'm just going to let him talk about that partnership. I'm going to pause a minute and then I'm going to talk about sort of our questionnaire. Like, probably the first thing I get when somebody's a question from folks who are thinking about delving into doing these easements, where do I start? I don't even know where to start. How do you open this can of worms, right? And so the first thing is to talk to your landowner. And this is where I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit. Most of y'all came from rural backgrounds and you have grew up in the farming community, and agricultural community, forestry community. There is no substitution for sitting down with a landowner and having a cup of coffee and actually talking to them one-on-one and asking them, what do you want? Because as an easement holder, we Working Lands Trust, Soil and Water Districts, y'all will be the ones that hold the easement. You are the advocate for that landowner. You want to make sure that you are doing right by them. And today's technology, it's easy to send an email. I mean, shoot, it's easy to pick up the phone and call, which is better. Lord knows. I mean, some landowners like to text. That's fine. But if there's an opportunity available, meet with that landowner face to face. Because there is no, even with the younger generation coming through farming, a handshake and looking you in the eye means a lot to landowners. And unfortunately, we've gotten away from being able to communicate, which is sad. I mean, it's not going to be, you don't have to get up in front of a crowd of people. You just need to be able to communicate with your landowner, know what they want, and let them know that you're there for them. So that's my little soapbox for a minute. But the next thing, so what do? We got a landowner that calls us, just like me and Mr. Ed right here, Mr. Edwards. We went out the other day. I had a landowner who has an ostrich farm. It's going to be fabulous, you know. I got to hold a baby ostrich 2 days ago. I was just in hog heaven. But it's over in Moore County, and he's thinking about doing an easement. Well, we ain't even started the process yet. We went out there and met with him. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted him to know that I was there to do what I can. We'll get the process rolling, but he needs to know who he's working with. If you don't have that type of communication, they're not going to feel comfortable working with you. So, but the next step for me would be to send him, we have what's called our questionnaire, our disclosure form. Ours now looks a little bit different than this. Lisa has updated it beautifully. We actually have some copies of it in the back of the room. So feel free to grab one of those. Once this is done, our PowerPoints, all of our handouts, I'll send to Amanda. They'll be on our website as well. But this sort of gets the ball rolling. This gets the landowner thinking about all the things that he or she may need to do for an easement and to get the project started. This came from one of y'all, I don't know, Soil and Water District. This was a easement ranking criteria. You'll find out with not that much staff capacity, these things are a lot to handle. There's got to be a ranking system. Right now we've got 40 applications in a proposed worksheet right now of people wanting to do easements with us. That's a lot. And you looking at the dream team right here, there's only 2 of us, you know, and Lord knows she's smarter than I am. So I mean, so you have to have a way to be able to rank these and be able to defend that, because you're gonna have a landowner that says, hey, my property is great, why didn't I get picked to go? And this is why. You'll be able to show them, hey, let's think about this for next cycle. This is what we can do to improve it. A lot of this stuff is gonna be reflective of what the requirements or the criteria or the ranking that comes from ADFP or NRCS. So the more that they can get points to get up higher, the better they're gonna have falling out to get actual funding if they go through. So project assessment, what do? You know, you think about it, what to carry, it's a field visit. I mean, you know, I carry a pair of boots with my truck at all times, you know, because you never know what muck you got to get through. Visiting the landowner, you need to take lots of pictures, document as much as you can. There's a lot of stuff you can do beforehand. Get your maps, get all the information, talk to your county folks, and there's a ton of information online. I mean, y'all know this, work with the soil and water districts. There's a lot of stuff that you can find just online and do pre-planning. That'll help you. That's your due diligence. Just like I was saying, public online tools for property research. It's unbelievable the amount of information you can find, which is a little scary, but you know, I mean, it's helpful for you when you're doing this. So this, like I said, these slides will be available to you. We've already talked about this a little bit, but these are all the different funding opportunities that you can reach out for. And don't forget, I mean, for us as a nonprofit, private funding is also another avenue. Can't really see this real good, but I can talk for Evan about this. Now, Brian, on the other hand, I'm gonna let him talk about his timeline on his own when he gets up there, because it can be a little different. And Evan can give me the nod, yes or no, or tell me I'm wrong or whatever. Or these two beautiful ladies right here, they keep me in line as well. But conservation, applying for funding. So ADFP, usually October through December.
As long as I've been there.
Okay. I'm not going to talk about NRCS. DOD, that's rolling. They don't have, I mean, it's our God-fearing military, right? I mean, they're doing things on their own schedule, so it's a rolling opportunity applications. Approval for ADFP is usually that following July and August. We're getting close. We're getting ready to find out what's going on soon to know what we're getting as far as funding goes. The NRCS, not even going to touch it. I'm going to let Brian talk about it. Same thing with DOD, rolling. It's all, they do their own thing. Duration, now, 2 years from the time of contract, okay? So you're like, hey, I put in this application. I mean, we should be, what, 2 years as soon as I submitted it? No. It's 2 years until you're awarded a contract from ADFP. That's typical. Now, have we got stuff that's running into 3, 4, 5 years? Absolutely. It's just nature of the beast, right? NRCS, I mean, I'm gonna let him touch it. I'm not even gonna touch it, yeah. And then DOD, again, rolling. I think Evan's seen them close super fast and some take super long. So, but typically, you know, ADFP are real, bless them, they're really good about being very concise and getting their stuff in. They run a tight ship over there. Not saying you don't, because I know, hey, I know your pain, I get it, so. This is just sort of the ADF, this is sort of their calendar, things that to go through to get you from that mid-October, mid-December, back to that next October. Due diligence and closings, there's lots of stuff, what I told you. So you think about environmental survey, regular survey, appraisal, conservation plan, forest management, conservation easement draft, BDR, which is a baseline documentation report, title work, knowing, making sure everything's good to go, closing statement, execution, recording, and funds distribution. So that's a lot. There's a lot of steps. But again, checklist. Yes, sir.
Is that schedule kind of typical for most organizations? I'm sure the starting month may change, but is that a typical
for ADFP?
Setup?
Yes. So like if we're putting in for funding for ADFP, that's a yes. Brian's is different. Now, if you were looking at doing, say, like a donated easement, or if you had private funding, it doesn't really follow that schedule. This is tracking the funding. So that's when most of your applications, because I'm guessing most of your stuff is gonna go through ADFP, so you're following their schedule, so. But so like we start picking up properties, I mean, we've been putting down proposed properties all year so far.
And ADFP has a very set schedule for the deliverables and different suites of information that you need to submit to them. So that's a part of the contract. And ideally, you're closing within the first year of the contract. The second year is there for, you know, any issues that come up to resolve those. So.
And when we say closing in that first year, it just depends on other match funding, right? I mean, you may have NRCS or DOD, so, but if you just had ADFP, we're hoping to do in that first year of the contract, if not, potentially the second. Not even gonna read through this. These are all different showstoppers, the hazards that could come up, right? Materials inspection, and I think Evan's gonna touch a little bit about that sort of risk assessment early on. Maybe, we'll see. But we just wanna make sure there's nothing gonna pop up. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, we had a property that, hey, it didn't, in the phase one, what we did, I mean, we got some flags. And so we had to go back and do some testing. And I was nervous. I mean, you had to roll the dice on that one. But I was like, I really don't think it's gonna show anything. Thank God it didn't. So, I mean, but you sort of need, those are the things that's just gonna have to pass the test. Again, the hazardous materials inspection. These are just a list, you know, that they'll have to go through. At ADFP, they have the information. It's like a checklist that you have to give yourself or the company that you're contracting to follow. Same thing, like we use Jay for a lot of stuff. This was a report that he gave us back. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of information in there. This one came through with flying colors, so. And then this is their field inspection checklist. This is one of those items that has to be done. Survey. You're gonna have a landowner say, hey, I just had my property surveyed like 6 months ago. We don't need to. Yes, they still need to have it surveyed to receive this type of funding. And we have a list of surveyors that we've done a lot of work with. We'll be happy to share it with you. But there's certain criteria that has to be met for both NRCS and ADFP. If they want to get paid, we have to follow by these guidelines. There's different requirements. Like I said, I'm not gonna go through all of them in the sake of time, but this will be on the slides when you get it from Amanda.
So with the appraisal, there's different times that you may need to get the appraisal depending on if you're applying for funding. But any easement appraisal is based on a full market value of the property before it's restricted minus the value of the property after it's restricted. So that differential is your conservation easement value. And if you're applying for funds from ADFP or NRCS, and we talk about 50% of the easement value, that's the value that we're talking about, that in between. We won't go too deep into timing of the appraisal, but there's certain situations where the landowner, it might behoove them to get it ahead of the application. Other instances where we can estimate it based on some scenarios that I think Evan's gonna go over. But in all cases, in most cases, you'll have to get an appraisal at some point in the process, or if they are going to take any tax credits or get any tax benefits for any donated portion of it. So like if they only get 50% funded and they donate that other 50% of value, they can use, we don't give tax advice, but they should be able to use that as a deduction on their taxes, and they'll have to submit an appraisal with that in order to do so.
So property appraisal comparables, is it always compared to other ag land? Is this an agricultural appraisal?
Yes, so it's called a development rights appraisal, and so the appraiser will have to look at highest and best use of the property as it sits today. So if that highest and best use is ag, that's what they'll have to look at, other agricultural lands for that value. But if there's development all around it and the highest and best use would be development, then they would could value it that way. So that's just the appraiser's job there. But the after value is as it's restricted. So it can only be used for farming and ag, and perhaps in some situations have a house or two on it. So they would have to value it with that against other comparables, which also gets tricky because there's not, you know, that many easement properties with these restrictions on them that have changed hands a lot in the immediate area to compare that to. So it's it can get tricky on that side. Yeah, yeah. The other thing I was going to add is that you do have to have an appraiser qualified and experienced in conservation easements. So we've got lists, ADFP has lists, and we have lists of folks that do that. There's a specific training that they take for that. And it's usually, you know, in the 2,500 to 5,000 or more range. I think we say up to 8,500 or something, maybe even 10,000. It's not your $500 residential appraisal either, you know, so they just need to be prepared for that. The appraisal, unless there's military funding, is required to be covered by the landowner, unless you've got another funding source coming in. ADFP and NRCS does not cover appraisal costs.
And that's something to always remind the landowner, you know, that is their responsibility. And so like when we have, you know, when we're coming into an agreement to do an application with the landowner, that's stated in there, that appraisal cost, they need to cover that. Because I'm gonna tell you something, you get down to the very end and something happens that don't go through, I mean, who's gonna be stuck with that? So you need to make sure that all those pieces are spelled out really clear. You know, you're gonna have to pay for the appraisal. That's the landowner's responsibility unless there's military funding. You know, a lot of the other due diligence items are covered with funding, but the appraisal is the big one. You have something?
Yeah, I was just gonna add too, with ADFP's deliverable schedule, the appraisal I think comes in, you know, further down the road. But you also need to at least have a really good feeling for what your numbers are on the front end, because if the landowner's not happy with those numbers and you've done all this other work, you know, spent money on it, so there's a little bit of chicken and egg. You might have to have an initial appraisal, get it updated, so the timing is a big consideration. The appraisal is also only good for 1 year, so within that process, it typically, you know, unless we're really moving things along, it would need to be updated at some point before closing anyhow.
Any questions so far? Other questions? All right, same thing. Oh, we got one.
It's not a question, it's just a comment from a field staffer experience. Two hardest questions: when do I get money and how much? And as Lisa mentioned, this appraisal up front, but always remember, in most situations, all the cost is from the landowner's pocket. So they get squirrely about that upfront cost of that appraisal. So that's where your communication with these landowners is real important because of that value.
All right, so this is sort of an example of a appraisal that we had done. We've used this appraiser several times. And you can see here, I mean, there was, you know, you can see the prior to the easement, after the easement, and that's the difference, 286. So that would be how much that conservation easement value was. Before easement, after easement, the difference is easement value. These are the things that you need. Make sure to have that conservation plan, which, you know, pretty easy to get. Usually we have them, they're in place. And then forest management plan, if they have timber, you know, on their property, I think there's a certain amount that has to be, what is that? How much is it?
20 acres of forest.
20 acres, and it has to have a management plan? There's a draft, like the conservation easement draft. Remember, that's the deed of conservation easement goes with the property. We talked about this earlier, purpose and conservation values. These are the ones that you're gonna cite, right? These are the ones that we're focusing on. That protected property consists primarily of productive agricultural land and forest land. You know, and then you've got outstanding woodland, riparian habitats. These are different ones as well. But our main focus is going to be the ag and forest land. This is the legislation that makes all of it happen, right? It's got to come from somewhere. So I'm not going to read through that. By all means, you'll get this in the slides as well. So that's going to be another question from the landowner. I mean, what you taking from me? I mean, what do I get to steal? Do I get to even farm? Like, what do I? You retain, the rights retained is, I mean, it's still their property. Still farming, forestry, recreation, minimal, rural. You know, can I have a house on certain circumstances? Yeah, there's certain things. Limited structures. But the primary restrictions, the main one's development. You know, I like to tell the landowner, it just, 20 years is not going to be a Dollar General sitting in the middle of your field, right? You ain't going to have an apartment complex. The next one that is very important, and we run into this, subdivision of the property. Let's say, Mr. Potter here has a piece of property, and it is 100 acres. But there's a road that splits it, right? The highway runs through it. 50 acres on one side, 50 acres on the other. And he's like, I want to put it all in a conservation easement. All right, we do that. And we tell him, hey, you can't subdivide it down the road. So, oh yeah, that's fine. I ain't going to put nothing on it, Well, as his untimely demise, he's got 2 kids, and he left the north side to his son, and he left the south side, 50 acres, to his daughter. Can't do that. That means you're subdividing that property. It has to stay together. It can only have one owner. Now, how come Mr. Potter got around this? We could have done a phase 1 and did one conservation easement on the top north parcel, and then phase 2 and did a conservation easement on the south parcel. And then they could both be in the kids' names. You just cannot subdivide it once it's together. Industrial, commercial uses outside of agriculture, dumping, trash, all these things. These are the restrictions we're talking about. Function and enforcement. Notice and approval. You need to, once it closes, we're the ones that hold that easement, So if there's anything going on, we need to know about it. But there is communication. It all goes back to communication. That's the thing. You're checking in with your landowners. You're making sure they know they can call you. That's going to help. Title work. I'm not even going to really go into this one too much. I mean, unless Lisa wants to jump in. There's a lot. I'm not an attorney and nor paralegal. But there's a lot. You just got to make sure that it's clean, right? We need to come in with a clean title.
Yeah, this is just a list of stuff to look for, and ADFP requires a 60-year search.
That's the big one.
And they know what they're looking for. You'll know what you're looking for over time. But showstoppers, and Ryan can help you look at this kind of stuff too, just to see if there's anything that needs to be addressed or carved out or anything like that before we go too far down the line.
That's right. It's a lot. But again, you'll have a checklist. Execution. Woohoo! Conservation easement. Baseline documentation report, closing statement, update title, remember, you've got to get that done. And then recording it. Okay? So you got to record everything. You need to make sure that you talk about re-recording, right? You want to do this about every 30 years because, somebody doing a title search way back or not too far back, they may not find it, right? So you just want to re-record just to make sure it stays in there, that people can find it, I guess. Then closing statement and funds. This is what y'all been working for. And the landowner will be able to get the payment, stewardship fee to the conservation easement holder. That's the other thing, that'd be y'all. So to be able to have easements on these properties, there has to be a stewardship portion involved. You have to steward the property. You have to monitor the property, which she's going to talk about, Lisa's going to talk about here in a second. But that's forever. This ain't a one and done. This is every year, somebody's going to have to go to that property. Somebody's going to have to lay eyes on it. Put your boots on the ground. Now, for us, as the easement holder, for us, that's every year. We got to go every year. We got to see it every year. Now, ADFP and RCS may have a little different schedule about how they do things, but as the easement holder, that's our requirement, is you have to go out. All I do is call the landowner and say, hey, we're coming out, check it out the property. Anything you want to tell, or you need to know, or, you know, and go and just make sure all the stipulations in the easement are being upheld. Grant reporting, there's always going to be, we got the final budget reimbursements, you know, we got to make sure we have our monitoring reports going to our funding sources, you know. So these are just this is your cleanup, this is your mop-up work. Got to make sure this happens too. So once you get that payment to the landowner, there's still some work on our end that needs to be done. And that means once it's all said and done, it's like a marriage. You're married to this property. Working Lands Trust has got a lot of marriages running around here, right? So I'm gonna let Lisa talk about some stewardship.
So now we have had this wonderful courting, and we've walked all the way down the aisle. We're married, and now we actually have to work to keep the relationship going. So stewardship starts with the very first interaction with your landowner. You're working on your relationship building, but you know, we typically think of stewardship kind of after the easement's closed and moving forward. So the annual monitoring, upholding and enforcing the easement, reporting, record keeping, that sort of stuff. So breaking it down into just a few buckets: monitoring, record keeping, and defense. So we are legally obligated to monitor these properties, and we are required once per year. There are some standards by LTA that have put out that once per 5 years on the ground is an acceptable standard. So if you're doing aerial monitoring, if you have a very large portfolio, very large wild properties, you know, in some instances that might work. But with these, and I say just because you don't have to doesn't mean you shouldn't, working with the relationship with the landowners, getting out on the ground, seeing what's going on, is really going to be your best way to handle that. ADFP requires getting their folks out once every 3 years, so they'll coordinate with you as to which ones they need to see each year. And RCS has a schedule as well, so they'll let you know. So just be aware of who else needs to go out there so you can coordinate those visits. For monitoring, record keeping, you know, staff turnover, landowner turnover, we just really need to keep good records so that everybody knows what the restrictions are, what's been going on in the property in the past, and especially if an issue comes up where you need to go to court. You need to have really good records to be able to present for legal evidence. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Hopefully that's not an issue, you know, that you'll be visiting sooner rather than later. But, you know, as these things age out and we get turnover in our landowners, there's likely to be a misunderstanding somewhere. So how to address that. So your baseline documentation report is your Bible for your, if you will, for your each easement. So it's going to document all your conservation values, what's on the property, when you close the easement, and it's for a couple of specific purposes. So we're doing this for agricultural and forestry purposes, but there's also other secondary conservation values that might also be involved. So we just want to document all of those and make sure that we show what public benefits the public funding is going to protect, right? And so we talked about a few of those here, farming and forestry, but there's others as well. And it serves as a permanent and legal admissible evidence in court. So that's, you know, we don't want to think about the legal aspects of this, but it is a very long 10, 15 page document with a lot of legalese that everyone needs to understand on both sides and be prepared, you know, if an issue comes up, to know what it says. So we've got a couple of examples in the back of some of Working Land Trust baselines. They all follow a fairly specific format, and ADFP has a nice checklist of what they require in theirs. We've got an older and a newer version that you can check out. So the newer one, the older one is not much different, but the newer one hits all of their current items, so you can browse through that. But it's got a lot of maps and photographs of the property, documents those conservation values and the conditions of the property. So specifically, if there's any structures, what structures they are, how big they are, general land cover of the property. So with these agricultural easements, you can convert from farming to forestry and back and forth, but what did it look like at the time of the easement versus your annual record of how it's changed over time. So when as close to closing as possible, when it's due per the ADFP contract, which is typically right before closing. So, but as a general rule, definitely don't do your site work more than 6 months to a year out ahead of time, or you need to get back out there and update that. This is just a table of contents. So there's one in the back that you can take a closer look at. The same list here that you can see a little bit better. But just hitting on all those different components, the IRS has a list of a few that are required as far as maps, and then ADFP and LTA, again, is a really good resource for templates and things like that, because this is pretty standard across the land trust and easement world. This is just showing ADFP's checklist, so they have very specific requirements, but checklist to follow online, so don't hesitate to refer to those. And then of course Ryan has left. Always go to him with all of your questions. He'll know all the answers.
So the idea, I know the checklist is a lot of text on the screen, but the idea is you're not going blind. We're not saying, give us a BDR, right? It has everything you need in here, and once you read into these, we think that any district staff is capable of doing a BDR. With a survey, it should be in the language of the surveyor, so you should be able to hand that to a surveyor and say, can you complete this? And they should understand the language and be able to do so. When we looked at these different ones, the only ones we don't have checklists for are conservation plans, but I think all district staff should be comfortable with that. Forest management plans, but you have resources with the Forest Service and private foresters who will be able to do that. And then with the title work, that's working with the attorney's office that you choose for closing, and they know exactly what to do, especially when dealing with title insurance, title companies. So again, it looks more daunting than we think it actually is. And the good part is Anita here, she'll be able to, she's an approver of those documents, and during this process, be able to answer those questions. I think that's really the preferred method, is that to have that communication with us so that you're not submitting something and then waiting for a review. If there are questions that come up, it's much easier to go ahead and ask those, be proactive, and say, what does this mean? Asking for that clarification, because then the approval process is much smoother. I think I could say that for both our side and NRCS. So never hesitate to ask those questions.
And Ryan left the room, but I was drumming up business for you. I said, send all your questions to Ryan. He'll know the answers. Right. And then we're here as a resource too. I've done about, I think, 200 baselines in my career. So it's just more of the list there. So what's the purpose of monitoring? So of course we're legally required to do it by the IRS, also by our funding partners. We have to submit the reports to them and abide by our agreements there. And supporting good stewardship. How can we be a partner to our landowner, get them some good information if they need it, network amongst other landowners. Of course, looking for violations. We work very closely with the original landowner, but as soon as it changes hands, you really need to work even harder on that relationship, because they didn't come into it with their eyes wide open necessarily, step by step, and know what they were getting into. I mean, hopefully they covered it well before they bought the property, but sitting down with them and really going through the easement document and saying, this is what it says, this is what you have to let us know if you're doing, these are where your buildings have to go, this is how much you can build, all of those things, make sure that everybody's on the same page and avoid any issues. Creating a record of changes and conditions of the land. Some folks, and I know Mikey is wanting us to start this, but some folks take the same pictures at the same corners every year, so you can see how it's changed, and that's neat from you know, just a land cover perspective and land use change, but it's also good, especially if an issue comes up, you know, with a particular spot on the property. You know, it's not necessarily required, I don't believe, by anybody here in the room or LTA. Some folks do it that way, some don't, but.
It's also a good, so obviously, we're not always gonna be in the same job forever, right? I mean, there's gonna be people that come behind you that are gonna have to monitor and keep up with this. The other good reason of having them go to the same place every year is that you know they got to be on the property. They may not have the same work ethic as you do, right? They may not want to walk that whole boundary line, but if you put stipulations in place that they got to, then you know they're at least on that property. So just sort of a caveat to help make sure the work gets done.
Yeah, and in your baseline, you'll typically have a map showing where the original photos were taken, so you can send them out to the same places every year. ADFP, you know, really asks for you to try and hit as many corners as possible, which I like to do as well, and easily accessible spots, so that it can be easily accessed in the future and take a picture from the same spot, you know, as best as practically feasible. So, also building community support and awareness of conservation. So we really want to have a good relationship with our landowners so that their neighbors find out that all the benefits of these programs and want to work with us as well. Word of mouth is really the best way to get it out there and build upon our conservation momentum in the community. Okay, monitoring, a lot of this we'll just breeze through. It's kind of common sense, but you'll have the slides to refer to. Of course, we talked a little bit about scheduling and coordinating with funding partners, anybody else who needs to be out there. Really making sure that you're looking at your baseline, checking your land ownership. There's some cases where it could have changed hands and you were not made aware of that, or a brother and sister that owned it together put it into an LLC or brought another sibling in, you know, who knows. But you need to be aware of the legal ownership, and so do the funding entities as well. Do your site visit. I like to think of the site visit as more of an opportunity to spend with your landowner, work on that relationship. You know, like Mikey was saying, sit down, have a cup of coffee with them, walk around the property with them. You know, don't sit there and necessarily just check off your checklist. Make the best FaceTime you can, and then work on your reports after the fact. You know, the better we keep our relationships going, the easier this marriage is going to be, right? We need good quality date nights, not just sitting there watching a movie together, you know. So scheduling, yeah, at least once a year. Of course, there's all kinds of common sense things about the timing. You know, if you feel like there's a red flag or something going on in the community or an adjacent property that warrants you getting out there or sending somebody to drive by more often, you know, more than once a year might be necessary as well. Preparing, reviewing your baseline, all those things that we were talking about. Different field supplies and fun things you can take out there. You know, you keep it simple, of course, but as your portfolio grows, there might be some tools that you can implement to make things easier. A drone, a rangefinder, you know, a magnetic locator. There's things like if you need help finding property corners, things like that. Instead of if there's an encroachment issue, there's ways that you can work on that without bringing out a surveyor first. Yeah. Sir.
One thing that I have just been hit between the eyes with, Brian, is if you have a very heavily wooded tract, the drone's a great idea, and I know a bunch of soil and water districts have drones. That's a great thing. So you're already used to it and you can handle it. I think USDA still won't let us have drones, USDA have drones, NRCS have drones. Is that right? Not yet. Closer, getting warm, so, okay. But if you can't, get you some good, recent, high-resolution photography. That will do wonders in heavily wooded areas and help you out a whole bunch.
That's a good point. For structures or dumping, property line encroachments, all kinds of things. Yeah. So when you're doing your annual check of the ownership before you go out there, also pull up, your tax records and lines, and those can be off too. But check your aerials and all sorts of things too. Okay, what to do on your site visit? Of course, we're checking boundaries, structures, anything that is quantitatively restricted or limited within the easement. Make sure you're keeping up with those sorts of things, your building limitations. Most of these agricultural easements are pretty straightforward, but if they've got a conservation plan or forest management plan that they need to be following, check those as well. See if they need to be updated. This is just some fun toys out in the field, all the fun that you're going to be having out there, flying, boating, right? An example of one of our stewardship reports. So we now use Landscape, and that is a software that the foundation is going to be making available to some of you. So if you are interested in, if you already hold some easements or think that you will be holding more than a few in the near future, it's a good way to go ahead and jump into the software. And it's made specifically for conservation easements and monitoring. So it's got, we've got a little video that you can watch too, where I talked about it a little bit. But you can keep all of your properties in there, have maps, do your monitoring. It'll track where you cover each year, where you take your photos each year. A lot of great things built into it. So you don't have to recreate the wheel there. Landscape.
What are y'all doing? What happens in case of a natural disaster that comes in, destroys a piece of woodland that you've got under easement, or you have flooding, have lots of erosion problems? What's done to handle those type of situations? Because that's out of the landowner's control.
Right. So the conservation plans and the forest management plans are probably referred to within the easement. All of the easements are worded a little bit differently, and we've got different templates, so I hate to lump them all into one. But they should be referenced, and then they are a standalone document that can be updated. So if there is a natural disaster or erosion or some other large-scale disturbance, that can be addressed in those plans. So it would just be an updated plan for restoration or however moving forward.
Yeah, and Bobby, one other thing on that, there's going to be an environmental warranty in the easement. And so there's something beyond just, what we're speaking of there. All those responsibilities are still on the landowner. So it really would not be any different to remedy those situations with or without the easement. So that's just something else to keep in mind. With an environmental warranty, with adhering to regulations and rules, so, that's, if there's a spill or that kind of thing. So really, a lot of those typical things that the landowner does anyways, it's still their responsibility.
So our stewardship report looks a little bit different, but with Landscape, you can create your own forms and questionnaires and things that you can just fill out in the app and then spit it out in a report. It'll do a map with all your photo points and things like that you can automate. So with your follow-up, like I said, try and spend good quality time, good date night with your landowner, and then come back and work on your reports and records and all those kinds of things. But I like to look at stewardship and say, what are the opportunities here. Is it an opportunity for cultivation? Can I cultivate this landowner financially, if you're a nonprofit, or with other interested farmers in the area, or for an event hosting, or something? How can I work with this landowner to get something that I need, especially as a nonprofit? Make it a two-way relationship. Education. What can we offer them? Cost share opportunities. The latest and greatest innovation. How can we connect them to educational resources? And documentation. Is this something that I need to be documenting? Is this something that needs to be in the records for down the road, that the next monitor might need to know if it's not you going out every year, that sort of thing. And of course, am I approaching this as a partner? We are definitely legally obligated to enforce the easement, but looking at it from a policing perspective is going to make things a little bit more difficult. You want to approach it as a partner. We have boundaries that we both have to live with, within the easement. We're responsible for certain things, the landowner's responsible for certain things, and just how do we keep this partnership going as best as we can into the future. Be a good marriage, right? Record keeping, I'm not gonna go too much into that. We talked a little bit about the landscape database. If you only have a few properties, at least an Excel spreadsheet, something, make sure that you've got really good records so that if somebody comes to you and says, how many easements do you have, where are they, whatever, you definitely need to be keeping good track of them and all of your documents for legal purposes. Standard operating procedures and policies, LTA is a really good resource there, so that you've got set standards for how you monitor or how you treat violations, were they to come up, that sort of thing. So this just gets a little bit more into the weeds on record keeping. In order for something to be legally admissive, you really need to make sure that it's created at or near the time of the issue, so you're not just seeing an issue that wasn't addressed a couple years ago and now you're rushing to document it. Created by someone with direct knowledge, so as much as you can, those boots on the ground, make sure that they're filling out the reports. Created as a part of regularly conducted business and as part of a regular practice of the organization. So that just goes back to your standard operating procedures and policies, having those in place. This just talks about really those due diligence items and whatever you did to get to the finish line, your title work, your survey, your environmental, all of that needs to be a part of time. Your permanent records. So just because you check that box off and you're done there doesn't mean that you're done with that piece of information. Talked a little bit about landscape. With government pricing, it's per user. So they've updated this pay scale a little bit, but it is a very reasonable fee to use. Landscape, we've got a video on that, so I won't go into much about that. And this is just another plug for LTA, looking at those standard operating procedures and policies. So they've got a lot of different information specific to stewardship, your transactions themselves. Governance and finance might not apply to you guys as much, being a part of the county, but good resource. And defense. So when you're looking at stewardship capacity and monitoring and long-term stewardship, LTA has a rule of thumb of 1 full-time equivalent employee for every 50 easements that you hold. So just something to think about when you're planning your program and thinking about the future build-out. Of course, that varies depending on size, complexity, all sorts of things, but some little guidance there. And we talked about policies and procedures and risk management, just making sure from start to finish and beyond. The title search, the communication with your landowner, you're looking for those red flags, showstoppers, et cetera, all along the way, making sure that you're avoiding risk as much as possible, deciding if it's too much risk or what do we need to do to mitigate or neutralize that risk along the way. what kind of stewardship funds do we have for legal defense? So I know some of the soil and water districts have county funds available, but if you don't, thinking about where that's going to come from. We talked about stewardship endowment. Evan will be back in shortly and talking a little bit about that. But there is a budget line that you can work in to get a stewardship endowment from these grant requests as well from ADFP. So up to 3% of the easement purchase, provided that that 3% is matched by the landowner or some other source. And with military funding, it's 1.5 and 1.5, right? That was always, a little bit of confusion for me. Ongoing records and communications. So again, notices and approvals, keeping up with your buildings, and any things that you need to be watching as far as conservation plan, forest management plan. What do they need to tell you ahead of time that they're doing for building? Do you need a written approval in your records? And enforcement. There's a lot of different ways to handle potential violations and different degrees of violation. So again, LTA has a lot of good resources for that, and just something that you need to be thinking about, like what is something that we can handle on a staff level? What needs to go to the county attorney or some other authority? What do we need to go to ADFP and NRCS with for their input as well? And resolving those issues. So just different ways to think about tackling that. Not going to talk about discretionary approval unless you want to meet me later, and stewardship funding. So Buncombe County does have a contingency fund, so they might be a good group to go to find out more about that and how that works. Don't know of anyone else specifically that has. Amanda, did you, other than Buncombe, does anyone have a specific pot set aside? And Ryan might know of others, but yeah, so this is new, newer to everybody, so we're building on that, but at the very least, try and make sure that you build that into your application, the stewardship endowment, so that you can get that match and start building your stewardship fund for monitoring and enforcement purposes into the future. So any specific questions? Yes, ma'am.
And maybe address later this afternoon. You've got a land planner, right, county planner. Let's say that, like in my area, I know there's what used to be called Tanglewood Farm. It was one of the largest farms in my area, and now it has Walmart and several shops. It's got a subdivision. Now it's building a hospital. What prevents someone saying, I want I-87 to go through this, you've got an easement? What prevents the community saying, this is in the best interest or for the safety of our community, we need that land for a hospital, we need that land for the school building?
If it's protected with an easement already? Okay, yeah. So what Celeste is talking about would be a case of eminent domain. So in these cases, especially where you've got state and federal funds involved, it's going to be a really difficult fight for them, So the more parties we can bring into it, the more kind of protection we have also, is a good way to look at it too. But, public dollars were put into these, and so it's a good reason for them to find an alternate location that, they're going to look for the path of least resistance, and they're going to find a lot of resistance. But these are not immune to eminent domain. The main cases where we see that is like a road expansion. So if you've got a road front easement, they might come in and take an additional however many feet for road expansion. And then you have to look at the easement value and the funding that went into that, and you get like a pro rata portion of the funding back out to those funding sources.
And I'll say this too, especially when you're working with landowners. I got this one. If there's like, hey, you know what? I didn't realize I'm gonna have to have one more spot to build a house or to have it. Don't open that can of worms. I mean, you don't want to start even going into the idea that any of these easements can be amended. You go into it thinking that it is the law of the land. It stays the way it is forever and ever and ever. So. But you'll get those questions asked. I would just say there is no way to amend these easements once they're in place. You know, that would be my best bet.
Yeah, not the ones that we have supported with state and federal dollars, you know, a donated one or some, you know, you still don't want to touch amendment, but you can tighten them up. But here we just want to do it good on the first round and leave it be, yeah. Anything else? Yes.
But I'd highly recommend like trying to get a GIS layer where we can put it like on our county website. And then also the planners can have those layers showing what parcels have those easements on it. Because a lot of, when they're starting to do development, they look at the GIS system and would like turn on the layer and say there's a conservation easement on that property. So they would take another path of least resistance when they're doing projects. So.
Do y'all have a layer for voluntary, the VAD?
Yes.
Y'all do already have that?
Yep.
I'll have to check, see if we do.
All right, everyone, once again, I am Brian Lodeholt. I am the easement coordinator for NRCS. And like I said, I cover across the whole state. I've only been doing this for about 4 years, and I feel like I've learned a lot in the last 4 years, but at the same time, I also feel like I know very little. Each project teaches me something different. I learn something new from each project, and some of our easements that have been closed for 20, 30 years come back to teach me something as well. So it's a continuous learning process. Every project is unique, but that's my opening spiel about my experience with easements thus far. I'm going to introduce you to our application process, and as I speak, I will kind of tail off and maybe tell a story here and there from my experience. But just to start off, though, I always like to remind everybody of the purpose of our program. And just think about this. This is an agricultural easement program. So as you begin to, both you and your landowners begin to court each other, start that conversation or remind them that this is for an agricultural easement because they may have in mind of other enterprises taking place on the property that may contradict the purpose of the program. So keep that in mind, the actual purpose of the program on eligible lands. As far as our applications, we take applications year-round. We can accept it at any point of the year. The biggest thing to keep in mind, though, is we have batching periods of which we organize all those applications we receive. We rank them to determine best ways to utilize our dollars. And from that point, we start to provide funding to the applications that we have the dollars to meet. I will, in the past, the last couple years, we've had our batching period happen around about the fall of the year. I am anticipating doing the same thing. To make everyone aware of when that time is going to happen, typically we do a public announcement. I provide my partners with emails to send out to all the entities to try to make sure everyone is aware. The biggest thing I think I will say there is you don't wait to start your application package when you hear about the announcement. You want to be working on that continuously or have something ready, or I'll kind of throw up a little red flag here and say that if you find out that the application deadline is about 30 days from now, that window might be too close to you just getting started and trying to meet. So it's something to think about as you're kind of trying to process. Do you have enough time? Do you have enough information to process that and be prepared to submit that package to us? All right, so where did you find our applications? It's on, I would say simply Google North Carolina NRCS. Our website will come up. You zoom down to the bottom of the page and you'll see these tabs, and you would select agricultural land easements. And on that page, you will find this portfolio of documents. And all of these documents, not all are actually related to the actual application, but if you are awarded a contract, you may find yourself familiar with all these documents. And I have that in that portfolio so that you're aware of all the different type of documents that you would see if you're awarded an actual contract. But we talked about checklists earlier. Everything has a checklist, kind of keep us in order, stay in line. This is the application checklist for the ASAP-L. And that's quite a bit of stuff on that checklist. And it's generally just information that you should be familiar with if you're going to have an actual contract or easement with an applicant. It's probably our checklist is probably no different from what you would be looking for if you were working with that landowner solely. The biggest thing I would say, though, compiling this, it's quite a bit of work to do that. So there's some things that I would think about as me and that landowner are recording each other. Is this landowner, are they willing to actually work with the U.S. government? Are they willing to have that long-term commitment, that forever marriage, that's what I typically call it, with the USDA? From this moment on, if you're awarded a contract, you're going to have to work with the federal government. And everybody's not comfortable doing that. So sometimes you need to have that discussion and make them aware. And it may not just be them that's going to be working with the federal government. It's going to be who's inheriting that land. Will they be comfortable doing that? So that's something to think about before you begin gathering all this documentation. Or something to think about as you're gathering this documentation. The other thing that I would pause and I would take a pause is just to be sure you clearly understand the information that's being requested from you in this checklist. He mentioned earlier that if you got questions along the way, it's good to do it early on in the process. So as you're completing this checklist, I would go ahead and ask questions as you approach those documents. The other thing to consider, I often say we are not the biggest game in easements when it comes to funding in the state. I would say that ADFP is, and we are a good accompanying partner for landowners to maximize the benefits financially of the programs that we have available. So with that, understand that we get way more applications than funding available. So it's quite possibly you take the opportunity to complete all the paperwork, but you may not be rewarded a contract in the end. So that's something to think about. Not everyone is funded in this particular program at this time. Now, I don't say that to discourage anyone from applying. I encourage it because it shows the interest in the state of landowners that are interested in having agricultural easements through this program. So that's my little spiel on that. All right, so one thing that's important for the landowners to complete is their eligibility with Farm Service Agency. And I think we're working on a really good partnership with ADFP to assist entities in ensuring that they complete that process the proper way. The other thing that we want to make sure that you have is all the persons that are identified on that deed complete the eligibility information with Farm Service Agency. So if it's a LLC that includes a LLC that includes a LLC, make sure everyone involved in each of those entities complete the Farm Service Agency eligibility documents. The first thing you're going to make yourself familiar with is our 41A. That is our application document for the parcel itself. It's actually I'll call it the sibling document to the 41, which is going to be an agreement between NRCS and the entity itself. So that's where we're going to actually start is we're going to find out whether, not that NRCS can have, or the USDA can have a relationship with the landowner, but can the USDA actually have a relationship with the entity itself? There may be entities that may struggle with having a relationship with the federal government. So that's another forever marriage. Not only that forever marriage with the landowner, but you're going to have that forever marriage with the entity as well. So we'll complete a 41A. The other thing that you will need to have in your application package is a written pending offer and also copies of the deed. And when you think about the deed, quite often folks will go online and provide a deed. I call it a quick deed. I'm not sure what the real name of it is, but it will lack information that identifies exactly where that parcel is. So you want to have the one that has the meets and bounds and such on it. So that will be included in your package. And also on that checklist, there are lots of maps that we'll need. And the biggest thing that I want to point out is to make sure that if you're going to provide maps, it clearly identifies the property of which you're offering. You want to also clearly identify the access to that property, or are there access issues that we need to be thinking about or have any concerns with. And some simple things about the map, just like a north arrow, just show us which direction we're going in, or have enough roads on that map or intersections so we can clearly identify where that property is. Good maps go a long way in telling the story about that particular parcel. All right, so I mentioned it earlier, the agreement with the entity itself. One of the, some of you may have heard me mention this before, but one of the biggest things that we run into when working with counties of soil and water is identifying that entity's true ability or documentation that shows that they can hold an easement. Documentation on who can sign off for that easement. Is it the county manager? Or is it a commissioner for soil and water? Is it a county attorney? Or is it a county financial person? That is an answer that each individual soil and water or county would have to provide in that application package. And let me back up here too. This is really big to me because one thing to think about is do you have the capacity to complete not only the acquisition or the application of it, but do you have the capacity to actually manage that easement after you've acquired that easement, managing the stewardship and so forth and so on. Do you have the capacity to manage that? And that is something to think about because it takes a whole lot of time to manage an easement. In particular, if you start acquiring additional easements on top of that, the work doesn't go away, it just grows. And you have to monitor them each year. And oftentimes, you get questions or concerns throughout the year that you would have to address. So be able to identify that you have the staff capacity to manage an easement. All right. And finally, one thing that's really important is that you obtain a SAMS registration at sams.gov. So I mentioned before that we have way more applications than typically dollars available for those. So we rank our applications. Our ranking is developed through a partnership of NRCS and other partners throughout the state. We kind of decide, take the opportunity to decide on what the priority might be for the state to ensure that we try our best to obligate dollars to the highest ranked or better farms that we might have soils-wise in this state. So it's a pretty competitive process. I think this past year I've had 21, 22 applications. The previous year, I think we got close to 30 applications. So it's a competitive process. The interest is growing. So keep that in mind as you kind of prioritize your projects. Resources. I find that the American Farmland Trust has a really good website in explaining the process of completing our applications. I think they do a better job than visiting an NRCS website. I say that they explain things in pretty good plain language. They provide some really good examples. I often will print out brochures such as the one that you see here and provide that to entities that are interested. I say visit that website, take a look at it. They provide information not only from the perspective of the entity, but also the landowner. So it's a really good site to visit and get a lot of your answers, a lot of answers to your questions. If you got any questions, please feel free to give me a call. I often find that a good resource is some of these folks over here in the blue shirts, if you got any questions. Also, in this area, she's not here today, but Ann in Beaufort County is actually a really good resource to give if you need to call someone and ask them about how they completed the process and so forth and so on. She's a really good person to call and talk to. And she can give you a perspective differently from a person sitting in my seat. All right, so here are a few errors that we find on our applications that either stop the show or we end up having to go back to the entity for clarification. Landowner eligibility. I mentioned it before, and I think now we're developing a good partnership and team to try to alleviate this particular problem, but quite often, all the landowners involved in the application don't get the proper documentation done at FSA. And I often also stress that the minute you have a landowner that's interested in signing up for the program, have them go into FSA to update their eligibility. You might learn something about their interest in the program by their efforts to go into FSA and complete the documentation. Are they willing to do that? And if they're not willing to go in and do that, that might be a showstopper for us. The next thing that we see on our applications is inconsistent easement sizes. The acres for the parcels that are being offered often don't match the various documents. So we may see on the application 50 acres, see on the map 60 acres, the deed may say 48. We need all the maps and everything to match so we know exactly what we're trying to sign up here. The other thing that, and this doesn't happen too often, but it's very possible for it to happen, is we don't have clear deeds. We may have aired property, individuals that are associated with the property that aren't accountable or accounted for. Understand that everybody that's listed on that deed must complete the FSA eligibility stuff. So if you have individuals that you can't get a hold of, that might be a showstopper for us. All right, signature authority. I mentioned this briefly. When it comes to some of the soil and water offices, knowing exactly who has the authority to sign, we just need to make sure we're able to identify that and we collect the proper documentation to show that those individuals can actually sign. And when it comes to landowners and signature authorities, sometimes we have an LLC that may not have clear documentation that shows who can sign. It may be that they need to establish some type of power of attorney, or everyone that's associated with that particular entity will need to sign all the documentation. So sometimes just determining who can actually sign off on that land acquisition it becomes an issue. And maps. I mentioned it before, sometimes we just don't get good maps that clearly identify what we're trying to protect here. So just making sure we have good maps is a good start. The other thing that I don't have on here that everyone should really consider is, and this was mentioned before, is that conservation plan. At a minimum, if you're going to receive dollars from USDA, you must have a plan that meets HEL requirements. And for some landowners, their farming practices, it might be difficult for them to swallow having that HEL plan. So one thing I would consider is if I run into someone that's interested in easements and they would like to receive the federal dollars, I would suggest that they try to work within RCS or Soil and Water to get an updated conservation plan. Like I say, you may find out that they're not willing to adjust their rotation if needed to receive those federal dollars. Be careful of getting into a commitment, that long-term marriage with a landowner that wants to get married for all the wrong reasons. That can happen. Sometimes it may be the dollars that they see that on the other side that they're interested in having. Remember that this is an agricultural easement that we're trying to go after. So I caution folks on getting married for the wrong reason. All right, so if you're going to submit an application to us, there's a few different ways you can do that. We have what we call the box, which is kind of like an electronic file cabinet, which I highly recommend everyone use. You can also send it to us by email, or you can send it to us by mail. I prefer either the electronic ways, but I will accept the application sent by mail.
I'm Evan Davis, and I get to talk about budgets after lunch. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take a deep dive into developing the budgets for conservation easements. We're going to take a look at how easement values are calculated. So a couple handouts that were passed out to you. The stapled document, that's the conservation easement budget instructions for the ADFP Trust Fund application. So this is a step-by-step document, and a lot of the information we're going to see on the screen is detailed in this document. And then the line item spreadsheet here, this is a good worksheet to help plan out budgets. So if you notice the line items, we'll talk about those, and also the different columns, those are the sources of funds or match. So looking at the Excel document and the information on the screen, here are the allowable costs. So the ones at the top here, this is with the trust fund. So not only easement purchase, but also many of the transactional costs that are required in the conservation easement process. So you see we've got attorney fees, baseline documentation report, closing costs, easement purchase, environmental assessment audit, stewardship endowment, and survey. We'll go into detail about what these are, what's allowable for reimbursement through the grant. With NRCS, easement purchase is the only line item available there. What are ineligible costs? Like mentioned earlier, the biggest thing is going to be the appraisal. This is going to be an out-of-pocket cost, usually borne by the landowner, but this is going to be a required cost through the standard conservation easement program with the trust fund and any partnership easement you have with NRCS or Department of Defense. Travel and personnel and administrative are not eligible for reimbursement either. So easement purchase values are determined by an appraisal. Yes, sir. Oh, microphone, sorry.
So I know with a lot of our other cost share stuff, some expenses that can't be reimbursed can be counted as in-kind contributions as part of the match. Do these count as that?
Yes, that is correct. So near the end of this presentation, there are going to be some details about the match requirement for these projects. In state law, there is a minimum match, so that this is a great place to plug in some of those. Both cash, which would be an expense like paying the appraisal, or the in-kind personnel or travel do count. So easement purchase, we're looking at appraised values. Now these are either going to come through an appraiser, and so again, talking about the standard conservation easement appraisal program with the trust fund, NRCS, or DOD partnership projects, an appraisal will be required. So with the trust fund or with us and NRCS, the USPAP standard is allowed. Yellow Book, the federal land appraisal, that's going to be required with DOD, but it is accepted with our program. So again, going back to the key word today, checklists. The trust fund has a checklist for their appraisals, what is required. NRCS has their own specs as well. So again, before you hire an appraiser, be sure that they have the correct certifications, qualifications, and training for rural properties and conservation easements. PUV, present use value. So this is the agricultural land property tax assessment. The trust fund has a program where we can, again, base values on an appraisal by the county. So we'll talk about those details in a few slides here, but that is a program that's exclusive to the ADFP Trust Fund. But the main point to remember here is that all these values are going to be determined by an independent source. Okay, there's no one that is providing their own estimates or giving their own assessments of market conditions. We're relying on the experts to provide the values for easement purchase. So, going into the budget instructions here, the stapled document, starting at the bottom of the first page. Well, the summary is in the middle of the page, but it goes into the details starting at the bottom of the first page. In our easement application, we require evidence-based estimates. And so in our application for the grant funding, there are 4 methods in doing so. So we'll talk about each of these in detail, but I want to give you some information. So we looked at the real project values of completed projects since 2016, and this is also in your stapled document here. What is the average easement purchase amount, and then the range being the high and the low. And so the trust fund has 7 different regions throughout the state. A primary purpose of those is to ensure that funding is spread out across North Carolina as evenly as possible. And of course, we know that market conditions in different areas of the state are going to be different. So that's why it's important to see the stratification between the different regions. So you'll see in this table, you have the regions here on the left, average per acre conservation easement value. Now this is the total easement purchase value per acre. If you remember in the morning session, it talked about the percentages that each funding source could contribute. That's an important consideration in this calculation. So you have the average, and then the low and the high. So when you have these initial conversations with landowners, and like Joe mentioned, how much I'm going to get paid for this, you have this data that is available through the budget instructions that you can help perhaps set the expectation with the landowner about what has really been seen through this process. So going back to the 4 methods, the first is the appraisal itself. So a certified development rights appraisal, this is the same document that's going to be required during the open contract period when you're building the conservation easement package. So a landowner can provide that to you during the application period to create the budget request. And this is going to be the most accurate because it's the same document that's going to be required during the open contract period. Like was talked about this morning, there's going to be a few things that need to be required in this, but the overarching point to remember is that this is not just an appraisal of the value. We have to look at the fair market value and the value of the property with the restrictions on the property. So on our website, we have our easement templates available for download. That's going to be critical for the appraiser to have because it outlines what the specific restrictions will be. So we just can't take one value. We have to have the difference, and we'll talk about how this calculation is made. But again, a good thing to look at is our appraisal checklist. It has a lot more detail about what's required. Again, a qualified appraisal and appraiser is going to be the IRS requirement. That's always a good thing to follow, right? So being sure, again, they have the right credentials and it's the right type of appraisal. Now, the downside of this is that there's going to be a cost. And as it was mentioned earlier, this is a $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 cost. So this is not a requirement, but again, if you look at these other estimates we'll see in the next couple slides, if those are not in tune with the market conditions of the area,
Well, we have to have some type of evidence-based estimate. So again, this is kind of weighing the two. You'll get a more accurate value of the property, but there will be a cost, and with a competitive grant process, there's no guarantee of return on that investment, right? So it is something for the landowner to decide. Now, our staff last summer, we reached out to other states that have similar programs, and we asked them, how do you do this process? And there were really only two examples or samples that we got back. One was they had to have an appraisal to apply. And we didn't want to do that because, as I just mentioned, that would essentially be a $7,000 application fee. So we didn't want to have it exclusively on that method, even though it would be the most accurate, and it could be a document that could at least be updated during the open contract period. Now, the other one was they had enough data that they could give you pretty accurate estimates at the county level. And if you notice this one, we haven't had a closing in the South Central region since 2015. So we had no data for that entire 10-county region. So they were able to provide those good estimates, and you get a pretty good idea, and then the landowner pays for the appraisal once they're selected for funding, and then at closing, they get reimbursed that cost if they go through with it. And unfortunately, we're just not in a situation where we can provide that good data for landowners to make an informed choice. So the next couple methods, one is another one that we used a long time, but these next two are going to be new to the process we just implemented in the last grant cycle. Comparable Certified Development Rights Appraisal. So this would allow entities to use a current or completed appraisal on an agricultural conservation easement project and use that data for the estimate. Now, the parameters around that, it has to be a project that has at least partial funding with the trust fund, so one of our projects, as we would say. And it has to be within a certain time period, and it has to be within the same county or within 50 miles. And what we're asking is that if you have some to choose from, pick the one that will have the most similarities to the project in which you're applying. So development, pressure, region, roads, topography, operations, if you can. Now, our rationale for this is we're using that real appraisal, we're using a real number coming from that, and we think this could help us get closer to the pin rather than creating another estimate from the tax card. Now, the downside to this, if you are a new district, you're not going to have any. You're not having any data to pull from. But we think that over time, as counties build their programs, having that set will help them in this process. And I think the main thing to pull from this is a real number, and we're reducing costs, that expense, that risk that the landowner's taking by having their own appraisal conducted. All right, the next two are going to be information pulled from the tax card. Now, I would say that this next method is probably the most common one that is used in our application process. This is pulling the values from the tax card when the property is enrolled in PUV. In our last grant cycle, 97%, so almost all of the applications that came in, they were already enrolled in PUV. Now, when we talk about this process and how does this easement affect the values, well, because of the terms of the easement, if a property is enrolled in PUV before the easement, it still qualifies afterwards because it allows for agricultural, horticultural, and forestry uses. So that's our justification for being able to use this as a method for estimating the easement value, because the easement allows for those agricultural uses. So what we would do is take the tax card and we would look at the assessed value, being the fair market value, and then we would look at the value of it in present use value, or the deferred rate, or the land use rate. There's different terms for that based on the county. And then we would take that difference between those two, and that would be the total easement purchase amount. And this is good because it doesn't cost anything. Now, there are some downsides, and here are some of the trends that we have seen. In more urbanizing counties, growing counties, the fair market value, the assessed rate, has not kept up with market conditions. So it's a little bit depressed on that value. So what happens when the real appraisal comes in, there could be money left on the table. That difference was not as big as it could have been. On the flip side, in more rural counties, we've seen that the gap is a whole lot bigger than what it actually is under easement. One reason for that could be the highest and best use is agriculture. So the difference between those two values are not as large. So in one scenario, the landowner could be leaving money on the table, and in the other, you're inflating their expectations beyond what actually would be an easement purchase amount. So those are the considerations on the tax card. But again, we have good justification there, and there is no cost to do so. Another new one. Yes, sir.
So, understanding that, if you're in a county where you have less ag and more regular property, so to speak, if they, let's say they just bought the property a year or two ago and had to have a regular residential appraisal, can we use that to get started, knowing that you have to have the more detailed appraisal?
Unfortunately not. The issue is you don't have the value of the property with the restrictions on it. So one thing that we've done in the past, and frankly it was just too messy to do, is that we would take that appraisal there and then use the PUV value and create that difference. But the issue is you're pulling in two different data sources, two different assessment methods for one equation, and it doesn't work out. So unfortunately, just what we've seen over time, that it's too messy for us to get an accurate number there. This is another new way to estimate the easement purchase amount. This is for properties not enrolled in PUV. So what we've done is looked at what is the percentage of the fair market value for the easement. So that sounded confusing. This is going to show you what that means in real terms. Again, based on the region, this is the percentage of what the easement is after the fair market value. So on your tax card, for properties not enrolled in PUV, you just have the fair market value, just the assessed value. So you would use these multipliers based on the county or the region in which the county is located and multiply it. So here's the real example, and this is going to cover a couple of the different scenarios we just talked about. So the statewide average percentage of fair market value is 45%. Okay, so we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now the appraisal here on the green and yellow bar graph here, the green is the fair market value, that high value. The yellow is the value of the property with the easement on it. So the difference between those two is the easement purchase amount. So in this example, the fair market value is $225,000. The value of the value of the property with the easement on it is $101,250. So the difference between those two, and this is the 100% potential easement purchase amount, is $123,750. So as mentioned earlier, there are caps for the different funding programs. The trust fund can pay up to 50%, and RCS can pay up to 50%. So if you had those two funding partners together, that could be your maximum there. Now going back to the percentage, if we take $225,000 and multiply it by that 45%, take a look at the number. That matches the value of the property with the easement on it. So if you were taking that tax card example, what you would do is you would see that the assessed value of the property is $225,000. In the budget grant request, you would then multiply it by the region you're in, and then that would be the figure, okay? Any questions on any of those methods or this, this example here? Because I think, we can talk about these values, but I think the real life example there helps put these numbers into reality, right?
How does the variable of duration of your easement is calculated into those numbers? Like I think you guys can do, 10, 15, 20, 30.
Yep. So
permanent?
Yep. So most of the easements that have been completed are perpetual. Okay. And reason being is that you have the option, depending on funding sources, of receiving 100% of the value there. Also, there is a federal tax deduction for the donation of conservation easements. So when we talked about bargain sales, that means you're receiving less than that 100%. If the landowner donates the value, so this is an in-kind donation of value on the easement, that portion would be eligible for the federal tax deduction. So that's another consideration in speaking with landowners, because this is a taxable event. The easement purchase amount is subject to capital gains. But as you move down in term, you receive less. Now, the next example is going to be based on present use value. That's a little bit different. But in terms, I guess I shouldn't say terms, in regard to term easements, those are going to have a percentage less based on the number of years. So the easiest example is going to be 10 through 40. Those are going to match up with the number. So a 10-year easement is going to be 10% of what that 123,000 would be. And then if we're capped at 50%, right? So all the inputs for conservation easements are going to be the same no matter the length. So on the land trust and district side, is that worth doing all that for that small of a payout, which probably the landowner wouldn't want anyways, right? But again, I think our view is that we have in the toolbox all the different options for all different types of landowners. All right, so going into the present use value program, this is a new funding program through the trust fund. It's really a different methodology for appraising the conservation easements and determining easement purchase amounts. And so this is this last grant cycle was the second year of offering this program. And so again, we're relying on a third party for the sources. In this case, it is the county tax assessor. There's a few rules that we'll talk about in the next couple slides. But this, again, is going to be how a real-life example would work. So we take the tax card, and we see that the value here is $303,000. And then for each county, we have a median sales ratio. And I'll talk about that more in detail in just a moment. But based on your county, you'll have the median sales ratio. Here in this example, it's 87%. And what that means is, in this county, it's a little bit less than what the actual market value is. So if you notice, the adjusted appraisal amount is bumped up to $346,000. Then what we're going to do, just like the last example, we're going to use the value of the land in use value, or the deferred amount, or the amount after deferment, and that's going to be $109,000. So again, if you remember that bar graph, we're going to take the adjusted appraised value, we're going to subtract the present use value. That difference is going to be the easement purchase amount. And so with these figures here, a 50-year term easement at 60% is going to be $141,000. A perpetual easement with a payout of 75% is going to be $177,000. So a couple things to point out here. The good thing about this program, you can sit down with your landowner during the application period and they'll know exactly what they're going to get. And so a lot of those questions about the appraisal, do I need one now? What will it turn out to be later? We alleviate those questions by having this type of calculation as part of the application process. If you notice here, the payouts are a little bit bigger than what they would be in the standard easement program. Again, A couple reasons for this. We're taking into account that market conditions might not match exactly what the assessments are on the tax card. So a little bit more of a financial incentive to use that amount just because the likelihood of the appraised value is probably going to be higher. The other part to that, and again, we've got a few disclaimers that we regularly say, and here's one. We do not give tax advice. But if a landowner wants to take advantage of the conservation tax deduction, they have to have their own appraisal. It has to meet the IRS standards. So, using a tax card and using an appraisal, looking at the same property, kind of like the example we just talked about, using those different methods, would it match up? Would it be eligible? I don't know. I don't give tax advice. But so again, going back to a little more financial incentive in the case that a conservation tax deduction is not allowed. So those were really the rationales behind the different percentages here. Now, the other good part about this is that there's no requirement for an appraisal during this process. So when we talked about ineligible costs, that's no longer the case. So the landowner doesn't have to worry about shelling out those funds for that appraisal. And then by taking off one deliverable on the schedule, hopefully that time frame to get to closing is shortened. So this is just an explainer on the median sales ratio. So again, in a county, some areas might be assessed in different ways. Counties themselves differently. So the median sales ratio is a way for us to have an equalizer among all the counties. So in our grant portal, we'll have a listing, or it's a worksheet and you plug in the values, but you'll notice that there's different ones for different counties. Some are above 100%, most are going to be below 100%, but it's just a way to equalize the value. So again, we're trying to standardize, make sure everybody's on a level playing field. Now there are a few additional rules with the PUV program. We talked about earlier about the deliverable schedule. One of the first thing you'll have during the conservation easement process is a preliminary survey. And the reason for that is to set the number of acres. With our standard appraisal program, a landowner could have essentially a customized boundary of their easement. It does not have to follow the parcels. So that survey is going to guide the appraiser on what is to be appraised. Now, since we're using a tax card, and the tax card has an assessment of the whole tax parcel, that's what we have to use. So again, in these conversations with the landowner, if they want to have an excluded area, or as we talked about this morning, subdividing without subdividing, if they want to do those types of things, they cannot do this program. Again, we have to use the independent appraised values, and so the county appraisal process looks at the whole parcel. So we cannot chop that up because then we're manipulating the appraisal, okay? So that's the biggest thing in this process. We're not including any values on improvements or structures. It's just the land value on there. And like I mentioned, everything else besides the appraisal is going to be required in the conservation easement package. Okay, so the first slide, we had all the different things, items, line items that are available for the grant. That's on here as well. How are these determined? Well, we look at the real data, and so we have, y'all are lucky today, we have Allison Rodriguez in the workshop. She handles all of these budget items. Request for reimbursement is, I don't know, the biggest part of your job, right? So we look at the real reimbursements that come in, and that includes grant funds plus match. And we look at what the total costs of these different line items are for individual projects, and that's how we determine what is the maximum reimbursement for these different line items. So if you go to the stapled document, you'll see the same grid that's on the screen. You'll see the line items there. Now, the appraisal one is just for your purposes. Again, we cannot pay for those. But again, these are broken out by region. I think the easiest example of why this is important is look at the cost for surveys in the mountains versus the other regions, okay? So that's the easiest cost to visualize there. But again, these are going to be the maximum reimbursements for the grants. So there's two things I want to point out about this. If you request more than this in your application, we're going to knock it down to the max. If you request less, that sounds good because we're spending less on the same deliverable, okay? So that's a consideration in your application process. And just for the long term, we'll say interests of the grantees, be sure to report the match that goes into these line items. Because let's think about it. If you only report what the reimbursement is, that's the only data we have for this. And so what's going to happen over time, right? So if costs are going up, which we know what the situation is, right? That's happening. We need to know what the total cost is. Our grant plus all sources of match. Then we can get an accurate picture of what those real costs are.
So what you're saying is request the whole thing and let y'all knock it down.
Yep, that's a good way to do it. That's the inside baseball, right? But we update these before each application cycle. So we're going to be reviewing these before cycle 17. We could have an inflation adjustment there. That's still being knocked around. So they could go up beyond what it is. But again, be sure to report all of those expenses. Okay, so we went through some of this earlier. The next few slides go into what are the allowable reimbursements in each line item. So if you look at attorney fees, here are the different things that can be accounted for in this line item. Title policy, title opinion, again, that minimum of 60-year look-back period. Title commitment, development and execution of the HUD statement, subordination agreement. This one here is a good one to discuss with your landowner. And this is something we include in our application, but it could be one of those showstoppers. In our application, we're going to ask for information on a lien. That does not disqualify anybody. But if there is one, there has to be a payoff or subordination agreement at closing. So the reason I'm pointing this out is those conversations with your landowners. If that's the case, have the conversations with the lenders ahead of time. Because you don't want to be in this process and expend grant funds, and then the lender says, nope, right? And in dealing with some private, they might not know that there is this type of cash transaction at closing that can help reduce debt load. So having those conversations early prepares your lender or even informs them of what's going down. All right? So again, this is something that it's common, but it's important to have those conversations. Now, if you're dealing with a farm credit entity, they're going to be more familiar with it, but it's still good to have those conversations on the front side. We have a document for closing agents. This is a very important document to give to your closing attorneys. We lifted a lot of language from NRCS on that document, so hopefully it has turned out that it's been able to work together, especially on partnership easement closings, but something to have for your closing attorney to review before that process. All right, closing costs, filing, recording, title insurance, wire transfer fees, pretty straightforward there. Baseline documentation report, we talked about what that document is earlier. The main thing I wanted to underscore again is that district staffs can complete these documents. And because it is an available grant line item, you can be reimbursed for district time for the completion of that document. So what you have to do for that is to have that approved document along with timesheets to accompany it, and that can be part of that reimbursement process. Now, another option is to contract that out. So if there is a land trust or other staff, the foundation, whatever, if they want to contract with districts to handle that, that could be an option as well. Again, this is a document that has a lot of different inputs, but we have a very nice checklist, right? There's the key word again, but a lot of those things can be handled in-house, or with just a little bit of work from other agencies. Environmental assessment audit, there's a few different options for completing this. For NRCS partnership projects, the NRCS interview, landowner interview and hazardous materials checklist will be the required document there. For our sole funding, we'll accept that. We'll accept a equivalent of that developed by districts, or the hiring of an environmental firm for a phase one. So there's a few different options there. Again, this could be something that is reimbursable to the district or for NRCS in your local office. All right, survey, we talked about this earlier, about getting the checklist in front of your surveyor and saying, hey, can you do all these? One big transition we had several years ago was the requirement of GIS. Why is GIS important? Well, much easier for tracking, monitoring purposes, but on our side, what we do, we share this with other state agencies. I think most notably DOT. That's part of their environmental assessment. We're getting that information out to them so that hopefully in these long-term planning processes, these are taken into account. We can reduce the impact of these types of projects on easements. So we're sharing that data proactively. That's a very important part. So if they can't do that, they cannot do the survey for this project. So again, it's a comprehensive document. It should be in the language of the surveyors. So again, make sure that they can complete all the different checklist items here. Stewardship endowment. So this one's a little bit different than the other line items because this is an expense that happens after closing. So stewardship endowment funds are for the long-term monitoring and the legal defense of the easements. And so with our current rules, we can provide up to 3% based on the grant from the trust fund. So what does that mean? Again, real life example here. If we paid out, being the trust fund, $100,000 for easement purchase at closing, that means the maximum stewardship endowment amount could be $3,000 as long as it is matched equally or greater by that request. So you have to have at least another $3,000 in cash from whatever source. And again, most commonly that would be a landowner, but there are counties that have these types of funds available. So it's a very good carrot there by having that equal match, because you're able to build up your funds. You can leverage state funds if you're from the county side, or as part of the appeal to the landowner here, we made it through this process, easement has closed, here's something to ensure the long-term viability and success of the project. All right, match requirements. So state law does dictate what the match thresholds are for these types of projects. And really, with conservation easement projects, we have not had an issue with meeting the match requirement. And if we go back to the standard easement program, where we can only provide up to 50%, all you need to do is complete the easement purchase. And so what I mean by that is account for the remaining 50%. So again, going back to the real life example here, if the total easement purchase amount is $100,000, the trust fund's providing 50% of that, so $50,000, where is the remaining $50,000 coming from? Cash and in-kind qualifies, so if it's just the landowner providing in-kind donation, that counts. If it's NRCS or DOD or some other funding source for a cash consideration of easement purchase, that counts as well. So if you look at the thresholds here for nonprofits and for counties without farmland protection plans, the minimum required match is 30%. For counties with farmland protection plans, it depends on their Department of Commerce economic tier. So Tier 2 and Tier 3 counties are at 15%, while Tier 1 counties do not have a match requirement. Okay? Now, with the PUV program, if you remember, it's 75% on the easement purchase amount. So that puts you at 25% remaining on the easement purchase. So you got another 5% there to account for. But I think through staff time, you could probably make up that balance. Any questions on the match thresholds? Again, through the standard easement program, we have not had an issue with that. Just something for entities and for our staff to look out for the new PUV program. So common mistakes with the application process. This nice stapled document walks you step by step on how to do the easement purchase or the total easement budget. So a lot of these questions we get, they're in the document. They're in the application instructions. So just be sure to review those. Again, if there are clarifying questions, we're happy to help. But a lot of good materials. I think the most important one in the application process is our checklist. We have an online application. We're not like Brian. We will not accept paper. Sorry. Way back when, we did do paper, and we are supporting the forestry industries in North Carolina. But grantees had to send in 2. Applicants had to send in 2. And so these were 75 to 100 each. And so right at Christmas time, that mid-December deadline, we were getting lots of mail in. It was too much. But with the online application, we have conditional responses. So it means if you select this, you get that. If you select that, you get something else. So you can't really have an application to look at. But our checklist has every single item that could be available, depending on your choices, in the application. So be sure to read that checklist. It's still available online. We're not anticipating too many major changes, so it could be a good thing to look at when preparing applications for this coming fall. Incorrect easement purchase calculations, we kind of alluded to some of those, so just be sure you have the right figures, pull in the right ones from the appraisal or from the tax card. We covered your scenario a little bit there. The 2 different sources, can't do that. Only having an appraisal with a fair market value, that does not get us anywhere. So just be sure the right type of appraisal is being submitted. Incorrect or missing data, so again, completing that calculation on the easement purchase amount. Outdated materials, these are probably some of the most common. Having a conservation plan older than 5 years. Forest management plan older than 10 years. In the application, and you'll see it here, there are some dates on how old an appraisal can be, so just be sure to read those. This is another common one, maps with missing information. So one of the most important elements is ingress and egress, so being sure that legal access is identified. So with a landlocked parcel, that is going to be critical in identifying those right-of-ways, but just be sure that all pieces of the proposed easement has legal access to a public right-of-way. Farmstead building envelopes not identified, so the areas in which agricultural structures are or could be, and then where residences or farm support housing are or could be, having those identified on the maps is very important. Placeholder documents. This was one that in our first workshop got a big response from our staff because that's something that, that's an incomplete application, frankly. So there could be scenarios where the most common example there is the appraisal. We're waiting on the appraiser to get it back to us. Well, just let us know, and we can work with you on it. When we're downloading the application, we see placeholders in there. It's incomplete. So just be sure to communicate with us if there are things that are delayed or missing. And again, if you're unsure, just let us know. We've got a 2-month window to start your application or for the application, so be sure to start it early. Don't let it be like your Christmas shopping right before Christmas, okay, in mid-December. Go ahead and start that early in October, just in case there are some hurdles, some missing information, getting that information from the landowner. So starting it early can help. And then missing signatures, if there are things missing, especially with landowner authorization, those could be things that we just can't move forward in the application process. So just be sure everything is signed that you upload, and I'll be happy to answer any questions on any of that or anything else.
You guys ready? I'll keep this short. First of all, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Lee Kennedy. I work with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, Division of Soil and Water Conservation. I am the CREP specialist for Eastern North Carolina. I'll show you a map at the end, and we got maps back there, and you'll see my territory. But there's 3 specialists that cover the state of North Carolina for CREP. I'm one of them. I'm relatively a new employee. I've been with the department, just division, a little more than 2 years. When I come into the division, we have a lot of turnover. Everybody's pretty much new, so there wasn't a lot of senior leadership to kind of take me under the wing and show me the ropes. It's been kind of a baptism by fire, but I've learned a lot, and I appreciate y'all having me here today. And I'm just going to go over this basic presentation about the particular program that I work on. I work on an easement program, but it's not farmland preservation. It's CREP conservation easements. And we'll just go through this real quick. And if you guys have any questions, y'all can answer. We can answer those questions when we're done. All right, so CREP, what is CREP? It's the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. It builds upon FSA CRP program. There's our little slogan at the bottom, farm the best, CREP the rest. What is CREP? CREP is an expansion of the CRP program, provides annual rental payments. Its goal is, number 1 goal is to protect water quality. Number 2 goal is to increase wildlife habitat. It's a program that's available nationwide. Obviously, I only work on the program in the state of North Carolina. And it's a partnership between the USDA and the state of North Carolina Department of Agriculture, Division of Soil, Water, and Conservation. To implement CREP, it all starts at the USDA FSA office. Before we can place a conservation easement, a CREP conservation easement on someone's land, they have to have an active CRP1 contract with the local FSA office. In order to get, these are all the different partnership agencies that are involved in implementing this program. Again, it all starts at FSA, and then NRCS gets involved because NRCS goes out to the site that's offered up by the landowner to determine whether it's suitable and feasible for the program. And then if they're going to use a tree planting practice, the North Carolina Forest Service, they have to write a forest management plan for these programs. And then, of course, the landowner signs up with FSA, they get the CRP1 contract, and then that's where we come in. If the landowner is enrolling more than 10 acres, there is a force requirement that that landowner must grant the state of North Carolina a CREP conservation easement on their property. If the landowner is signing up for what we refer to as federal CREP with the FSA office, and it's less than 10 acres, well, then it's optional whether that landowner gives us a conservation easement. So 10 acres is an important number. A landowner goes into a FSA office, wants to sign up for CRP1, sign up type CREP, then, and it's more than 10 acres, then they have to be willing also at that time, and that's where communication is very important. That landowner needs to be told that, hey, we can do this, FSA can do this, but you're also going to be required to give the state of North Carolina a CREP conservation easement on your property. This is the territory that our program is based off of drainage basins. The most western drainage basin is the Yadkin and the PD, and then it goes through all the counties to the east. And you can see those listed up here. My territory is, I cover the Neuse, the Tarpam, the eastern portion of the Roanoke, the Chowan, and the Pasquotank. So all of kind of northeastern North Carolina. I think I got about 27 counties that I cover. Environmental benefits of CREP, number 1 goal again, to protect water quality, improve wildlife habitat, stabilize the soil, reduce the nutrient load that ends up in our rivers and streams, and control the sediment. It also upholds good farming practices, and it generates income from less productive farm land. Land eligibility. Well, again, just circling back, everything that we do as far as placing these easements is downstream of the FSA contract. So the landowner has to go to the local FSA office and qualify for CREP through the FSA office before we can place a conservation easement on that property. So part of those FSA requirements is you got to have 1-year ownership, you got to have a cropping history for 4 out of 6 years. Now, this is based off of like the last Farm Bill. You know, it's not, I know we're in the year 2023, it seems a little counterintuitive, but as far as the cropping history and qualifications for the CREP program at FSA office, you got to have a cropping history for 4 out of these 6 years. And the land, you must have a qualifying water feature present. Regular CRP stands for, you know, we all know, Conservation Reserve Program. CREP is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which specifically targets agriculture production next to these qualifying water features. You know, what we're trying to do is take the portions of a guy's farm that's deemed to be environmentally sensitive out of production and place it into permanent conservation cover. Landowner options. The landowner, they have a couple different options. As long as it's less than 10 acres, they can just do 10 and 15-year CREP contracts exclusively with the FSA office. If it's more than 10 acres, they will still have to have a 10 and 15-year contract with FSA, but simultaneously they must grant us a 30-year or permanent easement. We pay $250 an acre for 30-year easements, and we pay $1,000 an acre for permanent. Currently right now, probably the driving force behind our sign-up is because we're able to take an existing forest buffer on our easements. So, an example, landowner goes into FSA office, makes an offer of 10 acres of ag land. That ag land gets vetted through FSA and NRCS, and it qualifies for federal CREP, right? Once we have that CRP contract, then if that landowner, if that farm that was enrolled on that federal CREP contract is adjacent to an existing forest, like in the 100-year floodplain, we can take that in. So for every 1 acre of ag land, I can take in up to 10 acres of existing forest buffer. So what that means is if you've got a landowner and they have 10 acres of ag land next to, say, a 100-acre bottomland that's in the 100-year floodplain, then I can take in that whole 100 acres, right? And so that landowner can get a $110,000 check as a one-time bonus payment from the state of North Carolina. So the driving force behind the sign-up that I've been seeing is the existing buffer. We have landowners that they get that ag land that's identified as environmentally sensitive through FSA and NRCS. They sign it up, they come to us, and then they also want to enroll the existing forest buffer that is adjacent to and contiguous with that ag land. And the ratio, again, is 1 to 10. Landowner options. The landowner, they get to choose. Depending on the practice, they can go up to 300 foot from a qualifying water body. I just went over this, the 1 to 10 ratio. And these are the practices that are available with CREP. We have a limited number of practices. We got CP3, CP3A, CP21, CP22, CP23, and CP31. But these are the practices that are available to a landowner that signs up for CREP. They maintain private ownership. Everybody wants to know where the money comes from. They will get their, based on their CRP contract with FSA, they'll get their annual soil rental payment as up to $150 an acre. That's one of the incentives for people to do CREP versus regular CRP because it pays double the soil rental payment, but it is capped at $150 an acre, right? So if your local FSA office says the soil rental rate in their, and I don't work for FSA, but they have a way of looking that up based on your soil types. If the local FSA office says, for example, your soil rental rate is $80 an acre, well, if you do CREP, CREP pays double the soil rental payment, but we wouldn't pay $160, FSA wouldn't pay $160 an acre, they would pay $150. They cap it at $150. Most people, the vast majority of our landowners that sign up for the program, I typically see them getting $150 an acre when they do the federal CREP contract. Cost share. The FSA, they will cost share at 50% of site prep and practice establishment. The state of North Carolina, we kick in additional cost share. For 30-year easements, we kick in 40%, and for permanent, we kick in 50%. I know all of you guys here, my audience here is well aware of cost share and how that works, but it's super important when communicating with the people that it's the cost share percentage is of a published cost, a listed cost, not actual cost, right? It's from an average cost list. FSA has their own cost list. The North Carolina Ag Cost Share Program has their own cost share list, and it's published on the website. But yeah, it's not cost share, it's super important. It's of a published cost, not actual cost. And let's see here. Yep, I went through this. $250 an acre for 30 years, $1,000 an acre for permanent. And landowner's responsibilities, the landowner does have a responsibility to make sure that the conservation practice gets established and is functioning as written in the conservation plan. Also, this landowner will have a contract with the ag cost share people in the state of North Carolina. Like the Soil and Water Office will work with the landowner to generate this ag cost share contract. And so they will have to be, compliant with the ag cost share contract as well. They have to follow the conservation plan. They have to follow the forest management plan. They can't farm, develop, mine, or do any unapproved timber harvesting within the easement. And, we monitor our easements as well. Management timber harvest options. Well, once the vegetation is established, I tell people all the time, CREP easements are not timber production programs. They are a conservation program about taking environmentally sensitive cropland out of production and placing it into conservation cover. So if someone is looking for a timber production program, CREP isn't the right fit for them. Within our easements, this is super important. Whatever is determined to be the qualifying water features, there is a 50-foot no-cut zone within CREP easements along those qualifying water features. So we do allow commercial thinning after the FSA contract has expired, which is typically our deed reads beginning in year 16, because those FSA contracts are for 15 years. But beginning in year 16, a landowner may go in and have his trees commercially thinned within our easements. He just has to have a thinning plan written by a registered forester. His basal area must be above 120. If the basal area is assessed by a registered forester, they can use the North Carolina Forest Service, or they can use a private consulting forester. But if the easement is 16 years old, landowner wants to have his trees thinned, a registered forester will go out there, evaluate it. If the basal area is above 120, the forester writes and submits a thinning plan to CREP management for approval, and we let the landowner go in and thin their trees. Any profit, they get to keep it. That's their money to keep. But they can't take the basal area below 70. But they do have to stay away 50 foot from the qualifying water features. If not, when we go out to monitor, they'll find themselves in a non-compliant issue.
What qualifies the water bodies? Did you already cover that?
That gentleman right there.
Is it
NRCS.
can it be a wetland, or does it have to be?
So creeks, rivers, streams, wetlands,
Okay.
right? The margin of a sound or an estuary. The one that's blue line streams on a soils map.
Mhm.
Blue line streams on a USGA topo map. The one that becomes.
But if it's a bottomland,
wetlands.
the edge of the
Yeah,
wetland.
anything,
Okay.
and I guess if it got really dicey and someone was arguing a wetland, then Army Corps of Engineers could go out and do wetland delineation if it came down to that. But I think the thing where we see the most, the judgment calls that have to be made with NRCS that I see is when it's an agricultural ditch, right? It's just a man-made agricultural drainage ditch. And the term we use is hydrologically connected. Where does the water go, right? When it rains, where does the sheet water flow coming off that farm, carrying that sediment, carrying those insecticides, pesticides, fertilizers, where does that water go? If that ditch is hydrologically connected, then more than likely it will be a qualifying water feature. I don't work for NRCS. I don't work at FSA. That is worked out between them. I think there is some, right, it has to be, the ditch has to have water in it other than associated with a rain event. Right, it has to be a certain depth, certain width. But most all agricultural drainage ditches will qualify as long as it's hydrologically connected. This is just the flow process. I've kind of talked about this briefly, but I mean, it all starts to the FSA office. Landowner goes in, makes an offer. He's interested in CREP, hears about CREP, sits down with FSA staff. He makes an offer. FSA takes that information. They use NRCS as a technical service provider to go out and do suitability and feasibility for the program. NRCS goes out and does their field work, communicates those findings back to FSA. Then FSA calls landowner up, says, yeah, the land you offered up, it qualifies for the program. Do you want to enroll? Landowner says yes. They sign that CRP contract. As soon as they sign that CRP contract, that's when the state of North Carolina, that's when my staff, we're able to come in and accept a conservation easement granted from that landowner for 30-year or permanent term. But again, everything we do is contingent upon that FSA contract. Here is the territory map. The yellow is me. We just filled this position. The person has not started yet. We'll start next week. And we have a brand new person named Maggie Gone. She's been with us for about 2 months. So once again, we've had a lot of turnover in this program. And, but now we're fully staffed. We've got new management, and I think everything's headed in the right direction. Anybody got any questions about CREP? Okay, thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about Sentinel Landscapes Program. The Sentinel Landscape Program is an area of 33 counties in eastern North Carolina that's been designated a special area by the Department of Defense, Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, and several state agencies where we're looking at how we can combine our efforts to help promote agriculture and also protect the military footprint here in North Carolina. There in your handout is a map of the 33 counties that are part of the Sentinel Landscapes area. I've been working with Sentinel Landscapes program for a number of years. I work mostly in Onslow, Pamlico, Carter, Craven, and Jones counties, where I have a specific list of landowners that the Marine Corps has provided, where I go out and talk to these landowners about conservation programs with either USDA or state of North Carolina, discuss with them if they have any natural resource concerns about their property, if there are any management expertise they would like to have in going forward with managing their property. And if they do, then we certainly refer them to the appropriate agency, whether it be the local soil and water conservation districts, NRCS, or the State Forest Service. So sort of kind of an in-between kind of person who's trying to fit these programs with these private landowners. We also offer, the military is also offering an opportunity to enter into either a 25-year term easement or a permanent conservation easement. And if they're interested in either one of these, and then I turn it over to the blue shirts, I turn it over to ADFP, and they all start the process of enrolling these properties into a conservation easement. So it's been going on for a number of years. We've had, I think, quite much success in this program, and all the military services have their own program. The U.S. Air Force has a similar program, and they're mostly working up around the Dare County Bombing Range. I think Rodney works a lot up there with those folks. Like I say, with the Marine Corps, the contractor we have, we're certainly in the counties. We're around Camp Lejeune, Cherry Point, near our air station. And the military was brought in because they recognized the fact that there is some benefits to protecting this land in eastern North Carolina. They train over this land, and they like to have the dark skies. That's one of the reasons why with the military easement, they prohibit tall towers or bright lights that shine up into the atmosphere on their conservation easement. That's two of the additional requirements or restrictions that a landowner agrees to participate in. So they're looking at ways that they can offer some financial incentives to these landowners to help them be more sustainable, to help them maintain this land in forestry and agriculture as well. So it's interesting working with the landowners. You know, I've been out talking to landowners, and these ospreys fly over the landowner at treetop height, and you get to hear all the stories about split walls, broken windows, light bulbs blowing up and things like this. And, you say, well, yeah, the thing about it is, they're going to continue training over eastern North Carolina. I mean, that's where their footprint is. And it's just an opportunity for landowners to receive some financial incentives for participating in these programs. And for those landowners who really have a long-term management goal of farming and forestry, it is a good fit for them. So anybody have any specific questions about Sentinel Landscapes that may be new to a lot of folks? Some of the folks here have been around, won't say as long as I have, but they've been around a while and are aware of the program. I said we do partner with the districts. I do go to the district some, talk to them about these landowners and their interests and things like that. Any questions? Yes.
If I don't know exactly which program they would fit in best, could I call you to come out and meet with them, and maybe you could help us figure out what program they would fit into?
Sure, I'd be glad to do that, absolutely. But I say, basically, I'm working off the landowners that I work with are specific landowners that Marine Corps has provided me. These are the parcels that I'm most interested in. But they do go off their list sometimes. So I know we have enrolled a few parcels that were not on their list. So yeah, if you've got any questions about that, particularly in these areas adjacent to these military installations, give me a call and I'll be glad to work with you on that.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions? Can I describe that map? There are a number of sentinel landscapes across the country that different branches of the military are working with, but most of the sentinel landscapes really focus around one military installation, like Camp Ripley up in Minnesota. North Carolina is unique because we have so many military installations in this part of the state that the state felt like it would be easier to combine all of them together, and that's why ours is spread out over 33 counties. So around, we've got Camp Lejeune. We just submitted a proposal to include Camp Buckner up north of Durham, which is our North Carolina National Guard facility. Also looking at the Sunny Point Depot down on the Cape Fear River down north of Southport as well. And but basically, this is kind of the overview of the 33 counties, and it's just the areas that surround the military. It kind of shows the military installations that are here in eastern North Carolina.
And this is an alternative to a few years ago when Virginia wanted to come and use our land because they couldn't use the Virginia land. So is this the alternative? They're getting around that like we won that?
Yeah, kind of, sort of. Yeah, the Navy kind of got their nose bloody pretty well on that one. And so, yeah, they were trying to come back. And we first did, when this program first started, we did a pilot project called the Market-Based Conservation Incentive Program, where you'll see where she just had that map, but there was a flight path around eastern North Carolina that crossed 33 counties. That's part of it. And we had a program where we did landowner outreach to those landowners that were underneath that 2-mile wide band through all those counties. And we took bids on what they wanted to receive as far as participating in a long-term conservation easement. And that's kind of got the ball rolling. And then since then, we've kind of converted to this type of operation as well. But it is that they recognize that there has to be a partnership with private landowners to be able to help protect this land under the flight paths or under the training areas. Did that answer your question on the map, or?
In the western part of Craven County, there's some low-level military training routes, and that's where a lot of our agricultural properties are. Would that better qualify them for your type of funding, either through REPI or your?
Okay. Yeah, REPI is a funding source that provides funds for some of the things that we're doing. With the issue that like Carteret County, Open Grounds Farm area, and that part of a lot of those landowners are on my list. And I've contacted them numerous times over the years to talk to them about the different conservation programs, and they're trying to judge their interest in participating in long-term easements. And another thing we have to consider also is Craven County is a little unique. They have some accident-prone zone through the county planning, which restricts development anyway for these lands. And some of the landowners receive compensation for that, and some didn't. So we kind of have to be careful around that area as well. But, with the county zoning that takes away those development rights anyway, we work with those landowners who don't have that restriction on their property. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, okay, great. Thank you much. Okay, and I guess now we're going to have an open discussion from all of our presenters on how to make multiple easements work together. I know we've talked about, and there's been some discussion about, can you enroll in all 3 programs and put the easement on the same piece of land? The problem there is that you can't put multiple easements on the same piece of property. So if one agency has an easement on it, then it's going to kick out the eligibility to participate in a different type of easement program. They can butt.
They just can't overlay.
So it depends on what you're just defining
Yeah.
property,
Yeah, so let's just say I got a piece of property, it's 100 acres. We've got, a stream that comes down to the middle of it. We could divide out, separate it, and do an agricultural easement on the uplands and butt it up against to say, like, I would think a CREP easement along the corridors, and that would be fine. You just have to make sure that's delineated within the property. You know, there's we got a landowner right now who's doing a mitigation easement. The other part of it is you have to have crossings. The agricultural easement, you have to be able to get from one side to the other. So let's say you got an agricultural easement on one piece of it, there's a stream, then the other piece, there's got to be a crossing to be able to get equipment or whatever it needs to be across that to be able to make sure you can touch both parcels, you know, both portions of the easement. So you can put multiple easements on there, they just cannot overlap. Oh, here you go. Hey.
I was just saying, we do have an example of that from Orange County where we had a CREP easement that was adjoining a ADFP conservation easement. And this exactly is what was described. We just left an area so that there is access from the CREP easement to the ADFP standard conservation easement. But yeah, that's how they kind of work together.
Just out of curiosity, with the districts that are in here, how many of you have used the CREP program? Have any of you? Okay, good. Some of our workshops, very few people had used the CREP program. And I'm originally from Orange County as a soil conservationist, as many of the district people know. But we did 2 really extensive CREP projects. One was with Grant, with ADFP, and it is a great access, you know, for the farmer, because both of those farmers in both situations, one, the large farm easement was under ADFP, and then along the street, 40 splits off and either heads to Raleigh or you go north. That farm sits just to the north of I-85, and it was prime land, and that farmer had offers for housing development, you know, golf courses, because it was about a 160-acre farm, and he chose to put it in a conservation easement. And plus it was directly upstream to Hillsboro's water supply. He had cows in the creek, so we were able to get the cows out of the creek, fence it off. The border, as you say, the perimeter of that easement butts up against each other, not overlaps, but the fencing that keeps the cows out of the creek is on the dividing line. And that's the best way to do it, so you know exactly where that line is. And so we were able to fence those cows out of the creek. It was a great win-win for the farmers in both situations, because the cost share was almost 100% for the farmer to put in water tanks, crossings, fencing, everything they needed to get the system for their cattle operation, but yet they were protecting that stream buffer. So if you aren't as familiar with CREP and you'd like to learn more, I definitely would contact your representative, because yes, there's extra paperwork, but it's basically, we laughed and called it ag cost share on steroids. It's just it's a few extra steps, but your CREP people will help you with the CREP paperwork, but then the rest is just cost share funds, and you work with your FSA and you work with your NRCS technical person to write a joint contract that for the technical work, for the BMPs. As some of you probably are very familiar, but for those who haven't had that experience, it's just some extra steps, but it's very much of a win-win for the farmers.
All I do 40 hours a week is CREP. I realized that people that work at the district offices, people that work at NRCS, people that work at FSA, if you look at y'all's pie chart of responsibilities, CREP makes up the tiniest little sliver, right? What we do is 40 hours a week CREP. So if you have a landowner come in, maybe you got a lot of stuff on your desk. There's a lot of stuff that's got to be done. You got some deadlines. Give them our number. We're a resource here for you guys. We can go ahead and vet all of this, right? We can talk to them about the program, all the ins and outs, and save you guys some time. and vet these people. And then if they're serious and they want to pursue it, then we will send them down to the FSA office to make the offer. But we're a resource here for you guys. I got hired right in 2020 when COVID started and everything was shut down. I think our staff used to do a lot more outreach and be present at some of these presentations, and that all kind of stopped. But we're starting to get that ramp back up now, and so it's nice to meet all you guys. I've met Brody before, him and Patrick at Craven County, but that's the only person here that I had met before. But now y'all know who the CREP specialist is. So if y'all have any landowners with questions, just send them my way, and I can take some burden off of you. No, just CREP. Oh, the conservation. Yeah, I believe so. Somebody from our staff will be. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Yeah.
That's a good suggestion, though. Yeah. Evan, I know you had just stepped in, but as far as, did you have any additional things you wanted to add about how to make, because I know with both, and with Mikey's presentation this morning, you also mentioned, there's all kinds of funding ways to get these things funded. So if y'all have, I know this morning we were kind of jam-packed, but we're running ahead of schedule now. Not to keep y'all if you don't have to, but if you have questions, now's the time to ask the experts, so.
Yeah, I would say with the different funding partners, it's important to check their requirements. I'd say that a lot of, and obviously the most common is us in NRCS, so I say that a lot of those requirements are going to, we would co-op many of them, but there's some, like the baseline documentation report, where ours, we have that as, a much more stringent document. So it's just important to keep those different requirements in mind and making sure that they work for both. With CREP in that example, one thing to remember is access, public access. And we don't have that map of the property Gail was talking about, but it's good because it shows two things. Both easements have access to the publicly maintained road. They both touch the road. And then the second part is you have to have access over the easements. So I think it was mentioned that these can't overlap, but they can abut each other. So if you have that type of easement along a stream and the stream keeps on going beyond your property line, well, it can't follow all the way to the end of the parcel if you have protected areas by another easement on the other side of that. So does that mean stopping it? Does that mean having the legal crossings over streams? So you always have to have that type, and during the planning process, do that mental experiment of, can I walk from the road to every part of the parcel and do it legally? So we talked about ingress, egress, we talked about right-of-ways. So having a lot of those documents in front of you is going to help the process later on. And I know that the ones that have been done in Hyde and Terrell, they had a little bit, there were some different things there with canals, right? And Rodney can talk about that. Canals and access and all that kind of stuff. So it took a little more digging on some of those projects, but it wasn't something it wasn't impossible. We overcame those issues. But the more you have up front, the easier things are later on, because if you have to answer those questions, you're more prepared. And the uncertainty around, is this going to be allowed? Is this going to be a showstopper, right? Do it on the front side. That's the main thing with this.
Brian, did you have anything?
Not on that particular subject, but I would like to add that if you were interested in as an entity in working with both ADFP and NRCS, even from the beginning of your application process, it's real good to communicate with all three of us that of your interest in participating in the programs. And if you're awarded a contract, the biggest thing that you can probably hang our hat on of being a big need is communication. We would need to communicate heavily on the process. It's possible that with ADFP you will have a contract prior to having one awarded through NRCS, and when you have a contract with them, you're on a clock with that contract is timed, and I'll let them explain that a little better. But eventually, if you're not awarded one through NRCS, you may have a decision to make whether you're going to go forward with ADFP or continue to wait to see whether you're going to be awarded an NRCS contract. So that's something to think about, and that might be something you need to have a discussion with your landowner early on so that they know their options, that eventually that they may have to reconsider pursuing the NRCS funding. Evan, is there anything you want to add on to that?
So again, talking about the easement purchase estimates. If the intent is to apply for our program and NRCS, you know, having that conversation, well, what if you don't get one? What happens then? If you're estimating from the tax card, what happens if this comes in lower? You know, what's the minimum per acre amount? What's the minimum total that of cash considerations would you consider for moving forward with the project? Because, you know, one thing to consider on our side with the other items available through the grant, through those different line items, the district who signs the grant contract is on the hook for those if the easement doesn't close. You have to pay those back. So that involves two things. One, making sure that you're not expending funds unnecessarily. And two, having the proper agreement between the district and the landowner so that if something goes sideways with the landowner, you have that type of contract or letter of engagement or whatever mechanism is being used to make sure that the county and the district are not going to be the ones left on the hook when it's not their fault that it doesn't go forward. So laying out those different scenarios is a good way to plan out for the future of the project, because that's happened a lot. I mean, these are not uncommon things. These are very common scenarios. When you talk about availability of funds, competitive grant processes, you know, not having the real appraisal done in hand before the grant, there's always going to be that risk of having depressed values or inflated expectations.
And I'll say this, that goes back to being able to have that conversation with your landowner, right? I mean, one of the most important things you can do, especially, and easements are complicated enough. You know, you get you an old-time farmer who's, you know, hasn't really known about easements or the process before, can even be a little bit more difficult, is going in and sitting down with them and spelling it out, and be prepared to repeat it like 5 different times, maybe in the same visit. That's the thing. Don't think it's just that I'm going to speak it now and that's just the way it's going to be and everybody's going to remember that. It ain't going to happen. I guarantee you when we walk out of here today, half of y'all ain't going to remember my name. That's what I'm saying. You have to repeat and talk through it with your landowner. Have it written out, black and white. Because when it comes down to it, like he said, and the project falls apart and he's saying, give me my money, you go look at that landowner and say, well, you know, you agreed to it. And that landowner say, I ain't never agreed to that. Have it in writing. You can do it in a good way. You don't have to come in there guns a-blazing like a lawyer, but you can show them, say, look, you know, as a working lands trust, we don't have that kind of funding to be able to pay that back. Hell, if we did, I'd just pay for the easements myself, but we just don't have that. So we have to have that in place to say, look, if something falls through, you know, this is a risk that we have to take, you know, if you want to move forward. So just keep that in mind.
And I'll just bring up on the stewardship endowment portion, getting the commitment from the landowner on the front end also, because once they get that number in their head about how much money they're going to get, it's going to be a lot harder to say, well, we'd also like to get 3% of that, at least to match the ADFP portion and that sort of thing. So getting that commitment on the front end so that's not a surprise, you know, when you're getting closer to closing. Keep it transparent.
All right, and on another topic, we often hear from landowners about how long it takes to close an easement. And in short, it takes a long time. It's a process that really takes a long time. And if you look in your folders here, it identifies the 5 steps of L for NRCS, and it has some duration down at the bottom, and one of it says from 1 to 3 years to get to closing. So that's just the NRCS potential window, right? But as an entity, your conversation starts way before that, and you may have a process of vetting your applications to determine which ones is going to be priority for you. So that first step of you meeting with that landowner, that takes time. So let's say that takes a year. Now let's say you're interested in applying for ADFP. Well, of course, they'll have a process of prioritizing their money and going through it. That'll take some time. And note on here, NRCS is doing the same thing. So that conversation of just initializing the talks of the easement takes quite a bit of time. Then you get into the process of trying to acquire it. So very, very easily, you can see quite a bit of time passing by in that process. It's nothing short for the conversation to start, and 5 years later, 3 to 5 years later, you're closing that easement very easily. And we're having these meetings here because there's a lot of interest in easements now. It's growing. So the process is getting more competitive. Every morning I leave my house the exact same time, and I get to work a different time. I don't know what kind of traffic is going to be out there when I leave my house. But that's how the process is for easement. You can start it, each one the same way with that conversation, but you don't know when you're going to get to that finish line. There could be a slow-moving vehicle right in front of you on your way to work, and you got to wait till it get out of the way till you can get to where you want to go. So that's just basically how the process works. It's hard to guess exactly when you're going to get to the finish line. It's a joy to get to the finish line. But along the way, it might be a lot of headaches, foul language. It can be tough. You've got to be patient along the way. But eventually you can get there. Anybody want to add to that?
I'll just add that there are some things that you can be doing that are kind of like common things that we see that are making the process take longer. One of the big ones is lining up your subcontractors. So the folks that are going to do the survey and the appraisal mainly, and then if you're going to hire out your BDR. I would encourage you to start thinking about who's going to do those things, even in your application period, and then as soon as you are awarded, going ahead and getting those scheduled. The survey's going to come first. That's what you're going to need in order to set your acreage, and so the appraisal generally follows that. But it's not uncommon for these folks, especially these days when there's a lot of development happening, to be backed up, upwards of 8, 9 months, maybe even over a year. So if you go ahead and identify those from the beginning, who you're going to use, make sure they meet our requirements or NRCS's requirements, and then have them kind of on standby. And then as soon as you get that award, be able to get them rolling or get on their schedule at least, then that's going to be a huge help to get your contract moving forward much faster. But yeah.
I'd like to add one thing about the CREP, but any easement, I guess. I know in our area, I'm from Orange County, so Piedmont area, before I retired, we would get a lot of calls in our soil and water office about mitigation companies wanting to buy a landowner's easement down their stream. And so might want to address how a regular conservation easement can or cannot work with that, but I encourage you too that if you have a landowner that calls you about that, or maybe you've been working with that landowner on a potential CREP project. I did this with my second big CREP project. I asked that landowner to reach out to mitigation companies before I started the process of CREP. because with the first big CREP project we did, the one along, that's close to I-85-40 corridor, I had worked probably almost a year, we got the contract set, we were ready to start construction, and I pulled into the farmer's driveway just to make sure we were ready to start in a couple weeks, and a mitigation vehicle, a truck with a mitigation company was pulling out of the driveway. And I just about cried because I just knew that mitigation company had come in there and offered that farmer way more money than CREP could ever imagine offering them. And so when I went in, I just kind of braced myself for, okay, all that work I'd been working on was gone. And at least the farmer could use, my best management practices that we were recommending as something to move forward with the mitigation company. And the farmer did not change, though. He said, no, I didn't like all the things they wanted to do, and you've worked so hard, we're going to stay with CREP. And I could have just kissed that man. I was so happy. But, on the second big CREP project, I told that family, I said, here's some names of some mitigation companies that are working in the county. I want you to reach out to them, and I want to be sure you don't want to go with the mitigation company first before we start working on this CREP project. They did their homework, and they came back to us and said, no, we're going to go with CREP. And they liked, the mitigation companies have a little bit more restrictions and things. So I guess one question, I think it's come up in some of the other workshops, if a farmer puts a mitigation easement along their stream, can they then apply for conservation easements? Would it be the same as being able to butt up against?
So, yes. And I think the short of it, because in general, the mitigation easement is only following that corridor, right? That stream corridor. So the uplands would be considered workable land, be agriculture or forestry or whatever you got. And so technically, as long as it wasn't enrolled, no, correct me for this, if they didn't want PUV, because you got to put the whole thing under easement. So you couldn't do a PUV program. You could only do the standard program, and you would have to survey out that easement so they would be able to butt up against each other. But you can't do PUV.
Yeah, really the same principles we just talked about apply. Public access, legal access across. So depending on how it's structured, it could be difficult if an existing one is in place, because if there's not established crossings, how do you get across it? So again, you just have to look at the recording of that easement and where the other eligible pieces of the property are. One question that's common with this because they'll often fence things out for you with those. That's a common incentive. Fencing is allowed with our easement. So, those should be restricted to that easement area, but if it happened to go outside, that would not be an issue. Right. But again, it comes down to legal access. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, like Evan said earlier, if you got the road, public road going along, you should be fine, as long as you get to it.
So this might be a little bit off the topic you were just talking about, but as far as Craven County and us coming here today, we kind of want to know just some basic, like, what is a district's role in the conservation easement? Are there different levels? Do different districts get involved, on different levels, or do you simply, help them at the beginning and then you're done? We're just not sure. We don't really know like what role we would play in this process, or if it's a choice of how much we want.
Well, I think a very a good starting point is this. Are you under the county or a standalone district?
We're under the county.
Okay, so that's how most are, right? So if you look at the easement language itself, the easement holder, which is the role of the counties and land trusts that we're speaking of, they are the primary enforcement, and that's a strong word for, really making sure that the landowner is upholding the terms and conditions of the easement. The easement holder has that job. So in this process, if the county, through the district, being the project managers essentially, are they willing to have that commitment to be the easement holder? That's really the first question you got to ask. Because if not, you can be a helper in the process, but you got to have an easement holder. Because when we had the wedding rings up there, and Brian was talking about that long-term relationship, I mean, that's what it is. So that's really the first question to ask. And I think that really one of the main purposes here is to have more counties with the districts being the project managers and the long-term stewards of the projects on board, because there are areas in the state where there is landowner interest, but there is not an easement holding entity active there. Now, Working Lands Trust does the whole state. There's one or two more that do that, but, being able to service all the landowners that want to participate cannot be borne by one or two land trusts across the state, right? So we're trying to build that up. So those components of that could be all the way from A to Z. And I think that's really what we're trying to get to is, here are the different parts of it and how to complete those parts.
Right. So we probably need to have a conversation with our county management and figure out if they're willing to hold the easements.
And I'll say this, and I alluded this earlier today, and talked with Amanda about helping the districts too. You're right, you should talk to your county to see because you're gonna be the easement holder forever and ever. So like Evan said, making sure that they want to be that role to take on, have the capacity to do it and be the commitment to do it. But I will say this, because I know a lot of you haven't dealt with easements before. I'm more than happy, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Lisa, but I feel like I can at least throw her out there with me or grab onto her. And I know Ryan will be part of this as well. If say like you had some of your administrators, your county administrators, if you want us to come in and you want us to talk them through the process, at least so they can understand what their commitment would be, I'm happy to do that. I think, Amanda, we talked about that being sort of a help desk, not just with landscape and some of the programming part, but just easements in general. So if that's something you want, let us know, and we'll be more than happy to come over and visit too. Because like Evan said, there's a lot of interest in easements, and there's a lot that needs to be done. So, I mean, there's room for everybody.
So would you guys just want us to kind of be like the clearinghouse for that district, and then like reach out to you guys, whichever one you think it would fit best, or is there like a clearinghouse that we can submit one property to, and then you all guys like look at it together and see where it fits?
Are you talking about like, so let's say you had 10 people come to you and you've got a bunch of easements and we're like, hey, we can't do but one, and then who do you send it to? The rest of them? Or?
Maybe like the specifics of that property, compared to each different organization, what would work best for that property owner? Okay,
so like what other entity would work best for them to be able to hold an easement? If it's an agricultural easement, by all means, Here, Ronnie wants to talk. He's like, I'm gonna tell you the answer right here.
I don't want Pam and Andy to think I'm dodging them. I've known them for a long time. I'm partial. I'm biased. I worked with NRCS for 37 years. I'm all in on soil and water districts. I love Working Lands Trust. They super partners. And like I say, you've got to decide that for yourself. It'll test the relationship of your county that you have with the county. The soil and water district has with the county. You've got to work that out. I think the word I heard earlier was communication, and then marriage, and then we got in a traffic jam somewhere along the way. But anyway, folks, it tests you. It's not easy, but it's worthwhile. We got a challenge we got to meet here, folks. We can't dodge this. And you don't, as I was talking to Celeste earlier, we don't go out looking for folks. We don't go take a club, beat them over the head, and drag them into office. They come to us. And we've got, all of us, more coming to us than we can handle.
Yeah, I think Lisa said it earlier. I mean, we got, just for this upcoming, like, proposals, we got over 40. That's a lot. That's a lot of ground, and, we'll have to vet them too, but, yeah, I mean, there's a lot.
Are you asking about the funding opportunities?
Okay.
Yeah, so really looking at it, I mean, you could talk to any one of us who's familiar with it, but looking at the different criteria, so NRCS needs to have at least 50% prime or significant soils. That's a big one for ADFP also, and it doesn't totally disqualify it. And Brian, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but did you talk much about RCPP opportunities? So there's other specific, and maybe because it doesn't apply to this area, but there might be other opportunities specific to certain water basins, because right now there's one with potentially Noose and with Cape Fear, but there might be others, later on that would apply. So military is related to the Sentinel landscape, but ADFP is a good place to start. And then in their application process, they have the interactive map link to say, is it within the Sentinel landscape or under a military training route? Does it have the soils qualifier to potentially be a match for NRCS funding and that sort of thing too?
Yep. So, and you're with planning, is that right? So here's the pitch. Yes, I want Craven County to be an easement holder. And here's the reason why. These easements are revenue neutral for the counties. As I mentioned earlier, most of the ones we receive are in present use value. They qualify for present use value afterwards. They remain in private ownership, so it remains in the tax base at the same rate that it was being taxed before. With our grant process, we're able to provide almost all of the grant funding for all the necessary items, as I mentioned, not appraisals. So through that process, we think that, addressing the concern about how much time and money will this take for the counties, we're able to offset some of that through the grant funding. So Craven County is able to leverage state dollars, return that money back home, and put it towards the protection of these working lands, which is huge down there, right? So if you have interested landowners, something that we have on our website is a landowner inquiry form. And so then when I see Craven County, I'll send it over to Joe because he's in that area, and he'll reach out to the landowner. He'll explain the program, what it is, because there's all different types of easements out there. So we're going to explain what our program is. And so being able to continue to farm, to continue their forestry operation, to change from forestry to ag, convert their pastures to forestry, right? So explaining all those things, restrictions on the development rights, but the focus keeping it in production. So making sure it's right for our program, and once that happens, if it's a yes, then Joe is going to be matchmaker. And so and what we do is we look at what counties are involved and what land trusts service the area. So if we don't have an active district, then we want to be able to start that relationship. So if you have landowners that you know are interested and don't know if it's the right fit, you can send it to our landowner inquiry form, and our field staff can filter that out. And then if it is the right fit for our program, we'll get them on the right path to creating that application if it works. Yep. Yep. And again, the long-term commitment is the enforcement of the easement. We have some funds for that, but obviously a 3% at the very beginning is not going to cover it forever. But, up until that point, the application period, obviously no grant funds for that, so that is staff time. During the open contract period, you have the option of having those different line items for those different processes to either reimburse staff or hire the outside contractors. Some things can be done in-house. Some things like the appraisal or the survey have to be contracted out.
And I'd just like to add on the stewardship funds, when that money comes to the county, it needs to be put in some fund where the county can't rate it or use it for general operation. It has to be in a fund that stays there as long as the easement, it has to be enforced. So that's another thing the counties need to look at. And the objective of this whole process is to educate not only the districts on, like Pam said, how do we get involved and at what level do we want to be involved, but also how do we reach out to landowners who might be interested in conservation easements. And I'm not going to put words in Amanda's mouth, but if there is a need for us, as Mikey said, to come down and meet with local county officials to educate them on conservation easements and what's involved with that and what the responsibility of the county is, we can certainly do that. But also, if you have landowners who you think are interested or who would like to hear more about conservation easement, we can come in on a small group and meet with small groups of landowners in a meeting like this and discuss some of the same things that we've done today. And I think we've got some funding for that, or we can find some funding for that. So Evan is real generous with us with promoting conservation easements. So that's kind of the partnership that we're looking for, is how can we help the district staffs be more educated, and also how can we help the district staffs reach out to landowners who want to participate in conservation easements.
So I got two questions. One for those of us that are still new to this. What's the difference between the mitigation easement and this? And two, I realize I'm probably in a special situation down in there where we don't have much if any ag. I don't think we have any privately owned ag land. What other options for easements are there, or other than agricultural working lands?
So, you and I talked a little bit. So let me speak to the second one first, and then you have to go back and repeat the other one, because I was thinking about the second one. I lost the first one. Like I said, I used to work with different land trusts. So there's a lot of different other funding sources that you could do, that you could look at for easements, like the Land and Water Fund. That's a big pool of money. It used to be the Clean Water Fund. There's a lot, and you're going to be looking more at like protecting riparian areas. There's going to be funding to help protect certain habitats, like longleaf and other specialty items when it comes to natural resources. So an easement in general, you can write the language how it needs to be in conjunction with the type of funding that you're looking for. So like, I wouldn't put for an agricultural easement if I was trying to protect just the riparian corridor, right? They're going to be restricted on what I can cut and where I can farm at and all that other stuff. So, and feel free, you can reach out to me when we talked about this before, but there's a lot of other funding sources that you can direct a landowner to as far as, the type of easement.
Like saltwater marshes is what
That's
you
right.
probably need to be protected. That will
That's
be
right.
filled in for some outside developer, but someone privately owns some saltwater marshes, what you're going to be trying to protect.
Yep. And there's, I know we're talking about easements in here, but there's a ton of funding to do, work and for those type of projects too, you know, that are specialty to those certain habitats and all that good jazz. But tell me again, what was the other one? What was the other question? What was the first one?
So what exactly is a mitigation easement compared to a conservation easement?
So, do you want to answer that? Yeah, look, he wants to answer.
I just started in March. I'm still,
Okay.
all this terminology.
Well, that's
is new
okay,
to
yeah.
me.
A mitigation easement is usually areas that are set aside to mitigate development properties. And the DOT does a lot of mitigation projects to offset their road building projects. Some development has to offset their properties that they're developing or converting to a natural area into some type of development area. And the restrictions on those mitigation easements are going to be dictated by the funder of those, whether it's DOT or Wetland Reserve Program or any of the other programs where these mitigation easements come into play. So it all depends on what the funders, what the objective is of the mitigation.
And let me put it like this, you know, when you think about mitigation projects, just think like, okay, Amazon, big old company Amazon, right? I mean, they put in like a 3 football field long production plant or sorting plant, and they've got to tear up all this ground. They're gonna look to mitigate, like if they had to bump out a wetland or whatever they had to do, it's basically looking to mitigate what they've done, you know. Same thing with DOT, like they gotta build a road through something, they're like, okay, well, I got to have X number of acres mitigated to offset. It's almost like offset, like carbon, you know.
So it's like the RCW stuff and things like that. Gotcha.
Any other questions?
Have you run into any counties not wanting to hold easements? Then what?
Yes.
Because I don't see my county giving me an extra bank account to not touch. I just don't see that. Call you.
I mean, that was why Working Lands Trust was created, to fill the gaps between the other land trust and the lack of the soil and water districts, you know, so that's our job. But we can only do so many at a time too, so that's why we're trying to share the love.
Okay, so you're saying you can hold them?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's what, I'm sorry, your name was asking earlier too, like what is there's the varying levels. You could help connect the landowners to the funders or other easement holders, or you could become the holder yourself. You know, there's different levels depending on what you can, you know, talk your county into and what capacity you have and those sorts of things.
Oh, go ahead, I'll do it after you.
And there's also co-holders. So is the stewardship the concern, that fund?
Well, I'm just not sure that my county would even want to be involved with holding easements or just be involved at all, to be honest.
Yeah. What county?
Onslow. I mean, and I could be just talking crazy too.
Well,
but.
and I would say there, you have a very important economic driver that we work with very frequently down there in Jacksonville, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity for landowners to do that. And so with the co-holder process, that means that there would be 2 qualifying entities that would share that responsibility. And I was waiting until he came back in the room because I left out this one part. That's not going to be only up to the holders of the easement. These easements have third-party right of enforcement. So the funding partners that provide the easement purchase funds, if the easement holder does not do their job, or if it's a land trust, they fold, or they need additional help, the state of North Carolina and the United States of America, if they're a funding partner, they will support if there is a enforcement issue. So you have that backing built into these easements. So, you know, that could be something to help alleviate some of the concerns being, you know, you're not going to be left on an island to enforce these things. So those scenarios are well, the third-party right of enforcement is required. That's going to happen in all these easements. But the co-holder example is common, and it's happened between counties and land trusts. And really it comes down to the monitoring capacity, because
The districts might not have that. They might not have the opportunity to have a dedicated account for stewardship funds. So I think, and there's some misconceptions. Again, that's why I emphasized about these easements being revenue neutral. And with the different types of easements we're talking about, there's all different types of restrictions that could impact the value of these. So our pitch is we're not taking anything out of the tax base. It's remaining the same. So if it's a concern, and that's something we hear from more rural counties, concerned about development and drain on the tax base, right? That's not happening with our type of easements. There are some easements that's going to completely drop or eliminate the tax value of some of these, or take it out of the tax base completely, but that's not what these do. So it's just, to me, it's really an education process on what these are and what they aren't.
So is the easement holder paying that portion of the property tax?
No, taxes are still on the landowner.
Okay.
These remain in private ownership. Mm-hmm.
So on y'all's deed, where it says John Doe grants, it will be, he grants it to a county? Like on my deeds, it's always granted to the state of North Carolina. Like we don't, right, we.
It's county or landowner.
Okay, that's, because I was, like I said, I'm learning, this is the first time I've heard any of this. Like with CREP easements, right, like in your county, the CREP staff, we enforce and monitor our easements, right? So there's no burden on the county staff for that. And on our deeds, when we close, it will list the landowner's name, grants 100 acres to the state of North Carolina, which is held by the state property office. But the CREP staff, CREP management, Division of Soil and Water, we monitor our easements. So, but with you guys, like Brody at Craven County to Craven County. Okay, all right, thank you.
And I was just going to add to, I mean, some of this has been covered already, but sort of coming from a district perspective, what you're sort of trying to convince the county of, or whomever that you're partnering with, is you're trying to build, I know we're focusing on the easement, and obviously that's an integral part of this, but what you're trying to build is basically a farmland preservation program. A good place to start with all this, I'm not sure which counties have which, but would be the VAD or the EVAD programs in a farmland protection plan. And so it's just like most districts have, obviously, your cost share program, you have an education program. This is basically just a third leg on that tripod, and that's sort of what you're arguing to establish when you're trying to talk to county management. For instance, Haywood, we began this in the VAD was in the 90s, but the easement stuff started in 2008. I think we were part of the first cycle, and it took quite a bit of time to establish the program. At first, we only were doing 1 or 2, and then eventually you get to the point as it builds up that you're getting more requests than you can actually manage. And so that's sort of the perspective that you kind of need to look at. You're saying your county might be reluctant. Is this a service that your district wants to offer its farmers of whichever county? And they all kind of work together.
Begin this process. I mean, I heard 10 acres on another presentation, but that was talking about something else. But what's the minimum you're looking for to even start to make it not necessarily worthwhile? Because any acre saved is worthwhile. But what's the number of acres you've got in your mind with this program?
I think Evan wants to answer it too, but I know it's going to be partially tied to the PUV requirements. So I think unless it's changed, there was a 5-acre minimum, but basically 5 for hort, 10 for ag, and 20 for forestry. And then of course that might change depending on which who your easement holder is. But basically I think the bare minimum, unless it's changed, was 5 acres.
Nope, that's right. So we're following the PUV minimums. So PUV enrollment is not required, but we want to have the acreage at a level where it could.
What's that acre?
5 acres for horticulture, 10 acres for ag or pasture, 20 acres for forestry.
Generally, if it's going to be a combination of uses, 10 is going to be the minimum. So, a good thing, if it's questionable, the smaller tracts, a good thing to do is just get with the county tax assessor on, if it's not already enrolled, could it be enrolled at this acreage size? Because you have a few points for PUV enrollment. Size is one, income is going to be the other major one, management's another, and there's another fourth point I can't remember right now, but the size is really looking towards, would it qualify for PUV? And horticulture, the 5 horticulture is going to be a little bit tougher. We don't have any of that qualified there. I think the smallest whole unit one is 13 acres. But there are some smaller ones as part of a larger contiguous operation.
Well, interesting you should say that. I know there's a chunk of land in Wake County, actually, and you may know about it, Gail, that the gentleman is getting ready to do something with it, and I think he has offered it to the state, and he's a nursery owner, and he owns a lot of acres in Wake County. They've flown over with a helicopter, and they are amazed that there's that much still in Wake County that is agriculture land. So, we heard that from a legislator at our recent Albemarle District meeting.
Other questions or comments? While you're thinking, on the back table are some resources that we brought for you to please feel free to take those. And one of those is this Conserving Working Lands Workbook. It's very good for district staff, as also it's a good outreach pamphlet to talk to landowners about conserving their working land. So please take several copies of those. Good late night reading when you have trouble sleeping. Keep it by your bedside table. Read it at night. Maybe a dream about conservation easements and have a good working knowledge. But there's lots of good information in that as well. Don't want to drag this on, but we certainly want to make sure everybody has answered all their questions that you may have brought with you today or thought of. Like I say, encourage, just reach out to us if you have any questions. If we're very flexible in what services we can offer, and like I say, outreach to other districts, working with districts we've talked about, and counties who might be interested in holding conservation easements, who think they would be. We can certainly meet with who we need to meet with on that ground. But also, if you have landowners that you'd like to maybe do a small landowner meeting on conservation easement or conserving working lands even, let us know, and we'll try to put together a program for that and help you with that effort as well.
We also have on the back table, Amanda put together, we started, this grant is through the Tobacco Trust Fund, so that was why one of the questions was how prominent is tobacco in your county, because that's something we're reporting to the grantor. And, but this started in January of 2022. And so Amanda put together a list of all the sessions and the website. You can scan it, and especially for those who are maybe newer to this process, if you didn't get a chance to sit in on a lot of those virtual sessions in January or early in 22, we've got them on our website, and you can listen to those recordings, and they're very good. A lot of detail. And then we had a series of lunch and learn webinars last fall, and I know we had a number of attendees. One of those also was specifically for landowners, and we actually had about 50 landowners that joined us over the series. It was 3 Wednesdays in a row for these lunch and learn series of estate planning. So, and we had a lawyer from NC State, Andrew Brannon, who did those presentations. So all of those, so do pick up one of these so that you can access that. And it may be something also to share that with your landowners that they can listen to at their, when it's comfortable time for them at night or weekends or when they're not quite as busy, especially this time of year. So we also have a survey. Tom, did you remember the survey?
Yes, they have the survey.
Yes.
So
You've
please,
got
is it time for them to finish it, filling it out,
Yes.
complete it? And just, you can leave them on the sign-in table over there.
That survey will help us know, with additional grant monies, what other training is needed to continue. And Amanda did introduce Ryan to start with, and Ryan, I'll reiterate, he is going to be your go-to person as far as he is being grant funded by the foundation, contracted with the foundation to sort of be a go-to person that could maybe answer more questions for you. And we'll be getting Ryan's contact information out and that type of thing. So we're very fortunate with some grant funding from ADFP to be able to have an individual that can help walk districts through this process. Is it right for you? You know, how, and he's got an extensive background having worked for Haywood Soil and Water.
That it? Okay. Thank you. Thank everybody for your attention and attendance.